Hi, this is Krishna Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank in Delray Beach. I'm glad you could join us today. This podcast is again the next 50 pages of this book. We have a title that has been forged, so I'm going to just show you the actual title that the U.S. government has hidden from view. It's Guardians of the Dynasty, made to look like some sort of novel, right? It's a military novel, right? This is actually the correct, title here is Guardians of the Dynasty, a history of the U.S. created Guardia Nacional de Nicaragua and the Somoza family. So it's about the U.S. created National Guard and, Anastasia Somoza, the butcher of, the people of Nicaragua. He was a butcher. He was a hardcore, military murderer. He was a rapist and a butcher. And it goes with the U.S. government, rapists and butchers. They're rapists and murderers of the U.S. government, criminal group of, rapists and murderers. So I want to talk a few minutes about two things. The first is the white mafia, the mafia in the United States, the white supremacist mafia. Be concerned about this group. It's present in the United States. It is a group of people who work for the federal government. They are actually normal people working for the federal government, but they appear in situations where there are murders and rapes of third world people, and they appear to cover up these crimes. They are present so that, America will never prosecute, murders by its U.S. Army, rapists and murderous butchers of the U.S. Army and its politicians. They will never prosecute these crimes because of a white supremacist mafia that exists in the American public that hides these crimes, because that is their second responsibility. Their second responsibility is hide crimes of rape and murder of third world people. It is an enterprise of white supremacists in America. It is an enterprise of white supremacists, murderers and rapists that the U.S. government forms with their public and their, whole government, their Congress, their president, and their people. All form a white supremacist mafia meant to hide the crimes of rape and murder of third world people. And that is what it is. So we're going to also discuss, so that's an important aspect, is to be aware of the presence of a white supremacist mafia in America that, whether they, act normal or they act good, there's still a group of white supremacist mafia gangsters. There are mafia gangsters that, enforce racism, white supremacist ideology, okay with rape and, murder and torture of non-whites and third world people. It is a dangerous group of people that exist. It is formed, pretty much most of the American public follows this policy of hiding rape and murder by the U.S. government. They're okay with their army doing any sorts of atrocities, no matter what they go. They are racist, rapists, and murderers of the U.S. government. The second thing we're going to talk about is the media, the Western media. We need to understand the Western media as an important and dangerous element of American hegemony. The media, the Western media, including the British and French media, including the normal outlets of, the London Times, the Guardian, Telegraph, BBC, France 24, Le Monde. These are important outlets to recognize as, promoting white supremacy and American and British and French colonialism. They have done so in the past. We have reviewed those, different articles that, Noam Chomsky has described in Le Monde and, in all of the different BBC and Guardian and London Times. All of these news outlets are puppets of the British government and French government for their colonialists. They are racist, rapists, and murderous butchers of the U.S. government, the British government, and French government in their campaigns of colonialism against third world peoples. Their most recent events in Venezuela reflects that, action, that, hiding the crimes of the American government, the white supremacist crimes, and then they allow the white mafia, the American mafia, to come in and hide those crimes. They're rapists and murderers of the U.S. government. They're rapists and murderers, butchers. So let's keep going. Let's, get started. I'm going to give some background. Those are important points. So let's get some background and let's get started 4 minutes into it. We continue with Guardians. So Guardians of the Dynasty, the book link will be in the description section. Please read the book link and, download the book and read the book. Again, I recommend reading all my books because it's, essential to understand the American history. the white supremacist mafia, the Western media, all of that stuff is very dangerous people. They're dangerous people that promote rape and murder and torture in non-white lands, in third world lands. Those three things will, result in your demise if you ignore them. They will murder you, they will rape your women, and they will torture your people if you don't stand up to their racist, murderous butchers and pimps and rapists of the U.S. government, their army, and their public. So continuing on, we continue with Guardians of the Dynasty. The first chapter is written by Miguel Descoto, a major figure from Nicaragua and a foreign minister. We discussed yesterday Miguel Descoto's review of the racist U.S. Army, Congress, and American public rapists and murderous butchers action in Nicaragua. Nicaragua was a huge geographic interest as the Spanish were planning to construct a canal through the country. The United States, Britain, and France sought to prevent Spanish construction of this canal, and the U.S. became interested in stopping Spain from developing a canal. He described the history of Somoza. He made clear that Somoza is a psychopath which transforms evil acts which are unquestionably evil in form and uniformly condemned into good acts and acts accordingly. It is as if he is detached from reality and becomes good with each murder, torture, and rape. This is similar to the U.S. Congress, President, Army, and public, who are violent white murderers and rapists who transform their uniformly condemned acts of evil to a good result, quote unquote, as we have discussed throughout the world. The U.S. government made Nicaragua a colony in 1912, and all important political decisions were made in the American legation at Nicaragua or in the State Department in Washington. The racist white thugs of Washington made Somoza into a legacy of despotism, murder, torture, and rape of the Nicaraguan people despite outcries from Latin America, including political leaders and major press outlets. The murderous white butchers of Washington failed to see the words of Somoza's close friend and relative by marriage, who states, among other symptoms, Somoza suffers from a persecution complex. He feels he is being persecuted and at other times the urge to persecute. He also has a deformed conscience. No cries of desperation were heard by the U.S. White Army, rapists, pimps, and murderous white butchers in their vicious campaign against the people of Nicaragua. Miguel states that if the United States does not stop support to the oppressive Somoza dynasty, then one will have to agree with those who say that it is far from having been, quote unquote, mistaken. The United States Nicaraguan policy has been intentionally criminal. We then discussed the history of Nicaragua, including the first conquest in 1523, when the Spanish Gil Gonzalez fought the Indian army led by Diriangen. Spain conquered and colonized the territory, who now bears the name of the Indian chief. The Indians could never be forced to accept servitude and exploitation. They were incorporated into the Spanish army conquest of Peru and Ecuador. The colonial period has never really ended. It is the oppressive, racist, rapists, and violent white murderers of America who, by virtue of the machine gun affinities, as well as Britain and the United States, forced the exploitation of the Nicaraguan people. The British had their murderous hands in first. In 1845, they took the East Coast, and then in February 1848, they clashed with Nicaraguan forces and defeated them and killed several of them. The United States then extended its capitalist, exploitative, and murderous interests through Cornelius Vanderbilt, who developed an accessory transit company, a combined stagecoach, and lake and riverboat transport system across the country. Vanderbilt's efforts conflicted with British control, and the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty in 1850 provided any future canal or railway across Nicaragua would be under joint American and British control, tolls equal to both nations. Nicaragua was not even acknowledged by the white murderous, violent colonial butchers and rapists of the United States and Great Britain, typical colonial mafia gangsters. The U.S. and Britain spread political conflict and carnage throughout Nicaragua following this treaty. Then William Walker, an American journalist, led an armed force of adventurers to aid the search for gold in Nicaragua. 58 men, then went in 1855, routed the conservatives, and captured Granada, and then the master of Nicaragua named himself as president. The typical violent white murderers, butchers, and rapists of U.S. public opportunism in third world lands was revealed. Next important is General Jose Santos Zelaya, who led a revolt and captured Nicaragua in 1893. Zelaya ruled for 16 years. The British withdrew with the help of American intervention from the Mosquito Coast. Zelaya brought a radical change toward modernization of Nicaragua than any other president. He was not able to continue this modernization because the United States colonial mafia murderous butcher intervention in the last days of Zelaya. The United States could no longer tolerate Zelaya because of his reform and nationalism, typical of the American army rapists and murderous white butchers. In 1909, the Bluefields on Mosquito Coast had a revolution backed by the United States to overthrow Zelaya. General Juan Estrada led this, and Moffett at the American Council of Bluefields required a pro-American regime, reduction of Nicaraguan tariffs, and an annulment of concessions to foreigners now owned. Secretary of State Knox admonished this gesture, who wanted to get rid of Estrada. Zelaya executed two Americans who set mines to blow up government ships. The execution of the Americans gave the rapists and murderous white butchers of the United States the excuse they needed to break openly with Zelaya's regime. Zelaya resigned as a result of American mafia politician dictums, and Jose Madriz took power, who was not suitable to the United States. He was thought to be likely to be the best president to date in Nicaragua, but Washington required a totally new administration. Estrada and Madriz continued the fight, but Madriz had to retreat, and in 1910 he resigned and fled to Mexico. Estrada was in power. General Mena, who was the war minister, was a threat to Estrada, and he brought Estrada brought U.S. advisors to reduce the military to little more than a police force. In 1911, when Estrada had been drinking heavily and dismissed the Minister of War Mena on treason. Diaz then took power as Estrada's vice president, and the U.S. promptly recognized Diaz. The Diaz's regime faltered, and the U.S. sent interventionists to protect it. General Zeladon was bombarding Managua when the Marines arrived and forced Mena to deliver his forces to the government. The U.S. basically occupied Nicaragua under Joseph Pendleton, and the rapists and racist murderous butchers conducted a vicious campaign against Zeladon and Mena to surrender. Diaz was put in power and was eventually succeeded by Solorzano Sacasa. The army committed atrocities over and over again against the locals. In summary, the mafia American government, murderous white butchers campaign against Nicaragua was a devastating reality of 150 years of colonization. So let's get started. We want to, get started. We have probably 2 hours and 15 minutes, something like that. So we're going to start with Major Carter's constabulary. Carlos Solorzano took the oath of office as Nicaragua's president on January 1st, 1925, and almost immediately asked the United States to suspend its plans to withdraw the legation guard. This request was quite understandable. Solorzano's army was small and disorganized, his party an uneasy coalition, already showing signs of strain, and his disgruntled electoral opponent was a man with a reputation for leading more revolutions than anyone else in Nicaraguan history. Rumors of impending upheavals were widespread, and it was widely felt that if the Marines left, a revolution would be inevitable. While unwilling to abandon the plan to withdraw the Marines, the State Department was willing to agree to a postponement provided that the new administration took immediate steps to create an American-trained, nonpartisan constabulary. The creation of the armed forces of this type had become a pet project of the department. In the words of Dr. Dana Munro, former United States chargé d'affaires in Nicaragua and later minister to Haiti, the establishment of nonpartisan constabularies in the Caribbean state was one of the chief objectives of our policy from the time it became clear that the customs collectorships couldn't assure stability by themselves. The old armies were or seemed to be one of the principal causes of disorder and financial disorganization. They consumed most of the government's revenue, chiefly in graft, and they gave nothing but disorder and oppression to return. We thought that a disciplined force trained by the Americans would do away with the petty local oppression that was responsible for much of the disorder that occurred and would be an important step toward better financial administration and economic progress generally. In 1923, the State Department had pressured the governments of all the Central American republics into signing a treaty pledging themselves to create such national guards and using suitable instructors with experience gained in other countries or in organizing such corps. This last phrase was obviously meant to suggest the United States, which was currently engaged in creating just such forces in the Philippines, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. The American experience had been far from satisfactory. In these cases, the Dominican Republic of the American minister had commented that the Marine trained Guardia Nacional Dominicana was in no way fated to ensure law and order if our forces should retire. Still, the State Department remained anxious to create this type of military force in other Caribbean area nations. Prior American efforts to get the Nicaraguans to implement the constabulary provision of the 1923 treaty had been unsuccessful, but Solorzano's military weaknesses gave the United States new policy leverage. In February 1925, the State Department submitted to the Nicaraguan governments a detailed plan for the organization of a constabulary. Although limited to 23 officers and 392 men, the force was eventually supposed to replace the entire National Police, Navy, and Army of Nicaragua. A separate training branch made up of American officers was to have complete control over the organization of the constabulary and was not to be under the control of the Minister of War. Furthermore, it was to have a total control over supplies accounts and enlistments. Solorzano disliked this plan, but continued threats to withdraw the legation guard force forced him to make some positive action toward creating a constabulary. Chamorro's supporters, however, were determined to prevent the plan from being put into effect, and when the Nicaraguan Congress discussed the proposal, it found itself threatened by a mob that promised dire vengeance upon anyone voting to create a National Guard. The reason for this opposition was made clear to the American minister Charles Eberhard by a supporter of Chamorro's. The Nicaraguan asked the minister if, in case of revolution, the constabulary might be expected to take the field against the revolutionists. When Eberhard responded in the affirmative, the Nicaraguan declared that he was unequivocally opposed to the constabulary, since it was only by revolution that a party opposed to the government might hope to gain proper recognition. Despite such opposition, the bill to create the constabulary was finally approved by the Nicaraguan Congress in May, but it differed considerably from the proposed by the United States. The power of the training branch was curtailed, and it was placed under the authority of the Minister of War. Control over the supply system, with its lucrative opportunities for graft, was given to the Minister of Police. Finally, the functions of the Guardia were defined as those of an urban, rural, and judicial police force, and nothing was said about replacing the regular army. This was considerably less than the United States had hoped for, but it was evidently accepted as the best possible solution under the circumstances, and no real effort was made to have the Nicaraguan government alter it. The next problem was that of finding an American to command the National Guard. The search was undertaken by the United States State Department, which finally selected Calvin Carter, United States Army retired, who had experienced in training native troops for the Philippine Constabulary. On June 10, 1925, Carter signed a one-year contract with the Nicaraguan government. He was appointed chief of the Constabulary and of the School of Instructions of the National Guard and was paid $600 per month. An additional $1,000 per month was allotted to pay for 4 American assistants. The proposed new National Guard differed from the old Nicaraguan army in many ways. It was to be recruited voluntarily and was to include regular complements of non-commissioned officers and company-grade commissioned officers. Recruits were to have uniform regular pay, training, and discipline. The Guard's loyalty was supposed to be to the nation not just to its leader, and recruits were to be drawn from all segments of the population, not just from partisans of the party in power. Unfortunately, it soon became obvious that the various Nicaraguan political factions were determined to transform the Guard into an instrument of it to advance their own political fortunes. On July 16, 1925, Major Carter arrived in Managua to begin his duties. He had hoped to find a force waiting for him, but was badly disappointed. The Nicaraguan government had sent out a circular to local jefes politicos asking their help in finding suitable persons for the constabulary. But since these officials were usually extreme political partisans, this proposal did not help to establish the nonpartisan character of the new force. Plans had also been made to have the legation guard begin the training of the constabulary, but by the time details were worked out, Carter had already arrived in Nicaragua and the Marines were preparing to depart. The State Department was determined to withdraw the Marines at the end of July, leaving the Nicaraguan their own devices. All that Carter had found waiting for him were 200 raw recruits who had been living on an administration food allowance of 30 centavos a day. They were quartered in one section of the Campo del Marte, Managua Central Army Barracks. The rest of Campo was still occupied by the regular garrison and by the Nicaraguan Army's arsenal. Carter and his American assistants immediately began efforts to improve the situation. Carter had originally planned to train the initial recruits for 2 years, then send them out to the provinces to train similar units to replace the police in each area. It soon became apparent to the Americans, however, that such long-range plans would have to be abandoned to meet more immediate needs. 90 of the original 200 recruits failed the physical examinations. The remainder lacked arms, ammunition, and uniforms, and the force had no machine guns. The budget was also totally inadequate, and Major Carter soon found himself exceeding it just to purchase basic supplies, including mahogany boards for the men to sleep on. In addition, the infant organization was given the task of forming the presidential honor guard and also of patrolling the streets of Managua. Despite efforts by the president's two brothers-in-law, General Alfredo Rivas, commander of the fort on La Loma, and Colonel Luis Rivas, commander of the Campo del Marte, to subvert the guard for their own political ends, Carter did make some progress in creating a professional, nonpartisan force. The government began seeking additional recruits, promising $30 a month to each enlistee. The force soon expanded to 18 officer cadets and 225 enlisted men, and a genuine effort was made to recruit men without regard to political affiliation. Had the political situation remained stable, the little force might eventually have fulfilled some of the hopes held for it, but less than 2 months after the Major's arrival, political violence again broke out in Nicaragua. The last Marine sailed from Corinto on August 4th, 1925. 3 weeks later, President Solorzano found himself facing a serious political crisis. It began at a party held on the night of August 25th in Managua's International Club. The American minister, the High Commissioner, Roscoe Hill, and most of the Nicaraguan cabinet, including liberals Victor Roman y Reyes, Minister of Finance, and Jose Maria Moncada, Minister of War, were present. Even the president and his wife put in a brief appearance. Suddenly, a ragged force, dispatched by General Alfredo Rivas, rushed to the club, announcing that they had come to liberate President Solorzano from the liberal element in his government. The objective they achieved by arresting Moncada, Roman y Reyes, and several other liberals. Moncada, Roman y Reyes, and several other liberals were arrested. General Rivas then sent the president an ultimatum demanding that he purge his cabinet of its liberal members. Major Carter urged Solorzano to crush the revolt, offering to shoot Rivas if he misbehaved, an offer which the president declined on the grounds that Rivas was his brother-in-law. Instead, Solorzano gave in to the demands. General Chamorro always denied any involvement in the International Club incident, but immediately after it, he returned to Managua to take advantage of the altered political situation. He saw the Guardia as the major obstacle to gain power and launched a campaign of opposition to that force in the conservative press. By October 25th, the general felt enough confidence in his own strength that the Guardia's weakness to move directly against the government. At 2 o'clock in the morning, he led a force up to La Loma, where the doors to the fort were opened to him by the commander. 2 hours later, Chamorro phoned the old presidential palace in downtown Managua and informed the surprised president that he had occupied the fort and would meet any attempt to dislodge him by opening fire on Solorzano's quarters. Taken by surprise, Solorzano pursued the usual vacillating course. Major Carter offered him the support of the Guardia, and he repeated his stand when Chamorro phoned to ask it. He would obey a presidential order to attack La Loma. Chamorro's only response to this was a laughing request that Carter phone him before he attacked. Since the Guardia had only 30 rounds of ammunition per man, such good humor was quite understandable. Carter begged for additional arms and ammunition, but the president was afraid to resist Chamorro. Up on La Loma, things were going quite well for the general of the commander Campo de Marte, who opened his gates to Chamorro, and all but one of the regional military commanders agreed to obey his orders. With Solorzano's decision not to resist, the success of the virtually bloodless coup seemed assured. In a conference the following day, the president agreed to Chamorro's demands that all remaining liberals be removed from government posts, that Chamorro be made commanding general of the army, and that the government grant an amnesty to all his followers and pay all the expenses of the uprising. And Carlos Solorzano remained president, but control of Nicaragua was now in the hands of General Emiliano Chamorro. Following his agreement with the president, Chamorro's attitude toward the National Guard underwent a striking reversal. Shortly after assuming his post as army commander, he visited the Guard compound and promised full rights and privileges to the 140 liberals in the force. At the same time, Major Carter made it clear that troops who were members of that party could resign, and 73 took advantage of this. Chamorro now began building up the Guard with the same zeal he had earlier exhibited in trying to tear it down. This seeming paradox was explained by Minister Eberhard in a message to the State Department. Logically enough, the ins are usually in favor of well-trained constabulary. Such was the case recently when the liberals who wanted the constabulary placed in command of La Loma. The Chamorro elements were opposed. It is doubtful if in these countries such an organization, free from politics, is ever wanted, but rather one made up largely of men of the same political faith as those held in power. Thus, General Chamorro and the conservatives as a whole, who formerly opposed strengthening the organization, now recommended its increase in several hundreds of men and their continued training under Major Carter. Solorzano's days as president are now numbered. Following the October coup, Vice President Sacasa had fled the country. Congress, now purged of most of its liberal members, obediently declared the office of vice president vacant, banishing Sacasa for 2 years for allegedly buying arms in Guatemala to use in a revolution. Congress then selected General Chamorro as first designado, putting him directly in line to succeed Solorzano. All of these alarmed the State Department, which was committed to a policy of non-recognition of Central American governments that took power by violent or other extra-constitutional means. The department made repeated efforts to persuade the general not to replace Solorzano, but they were ignored. On January 6, 1926, Secretary of State Kellogg told Minister Eberhard to make it clear that any government headed by Chamorro would not be recognized. Chamorro remained determined. On January 16th, for reasons of health, Congress granted Solorzano an indefinite leave of absence, and General Chamorro assumed the executive power. On January 22nd, Secretary Kellogg informed both Eberhard and the Nicaraguan minister in Washington that the United States would not recognize the new administration now or in the future. Having gained power, however, the general was determined to retain it as long as possible. On March 13, the Nicaraguan Congress accepted President Solorzano's resignation, and Chamorro formally replaced him. His term as president was destined to be brief and violent. For months, the American legation in Managua had been predicting that the liberals soon would resort to force to regain their position in the government. Their uprising finally began on May 2nd, 1926, with an exile force seized Bluefield. Chamorro responded rapidly to this threat to his regime. He expanded his regular army to over 5,000 men and sent them along with 200 members of the National Guard against the liberals. This combined force soon crushed the uprising, but in this setback failed to dampen the liberals' determination to overthrow the government. In his effort to retain power, General Chamorro was counting heavily upon the support of the Guardia. All pretense of nonpartisanship in that force was now abandoned, and new recruits were screened to ensure their total loyalty to the conservative caudillo. By March 1926, the American minister reported that the Guard was fast disintegrating into a politically controlled machine, or the present regime, and in early May he added that hopes for an efficient organization under American ideas and ideals are fastly disappearing. Eberhart, who admired Major Carter and sympathized with his efforts, blamed all of the Guard's problems on divided authority and political intrigue. He then summed up the entire situation by writing, "It is very apparent that the time has not yet come, if it ever will, when a nonpartisan constabulary or National Guard, organized and maintained on American ideas and ideals, will be a success in Nicaragua. It is not wanted. Just as the president may be conservative or liberal, so will insist that the organization be made up of men of his following. General Chamorro is doing this at present. The future of the organization will depend largely upon the extent which an American instructor like Major Carter, assisted by other Americans, can contend against this condition and the tendency of the president and his advisors to interfere with the interior administration of the organization." Again, American meddling. The sending of the Guard into battle against the liberals was simply that last in a long series of events which ended in the high hopes once held by the United States for this force. His creation, nevertheless, signaled a turning point in Nicaraguan military history. Nonpartisan it was not, but it was better disciplined, better trained, and better led by any of the previous Nicaraguan forces. The importance of this contribution to the crushing of the initial liberal uprising was clearly reflected by the casualty figures from the campaign. The regular army lost only 12 men out of a force of 5,000, but Guardia casualties were between 13 and 26 out of approximately 200 engaged. The regular army lost only 12 men out of a force of 5. This meant that the Guard's casualty rate was between 27 and 54 times as high as those of the rest of the army. Malaria also took a heavy toll on the Guard, and until it was totally reorganized by the Marines in 1927, it would never again be an effective fighting force. In June, the American minister was recalled from Nicaragua, and a young legation secretary, Lawrence Dennis, became in charge. And since the United States would not recognize Chamorro, Dennis decided that it was his task to remove the general from office. To facilitate this, Dennis urged that the revenue from customs be denied to the government and that all American officers be removed from the Guard. The State Department, however, limited its response to authorizing Dennis to tell Major Carter and his aide, Major Rodriguez, that if they take an active part in the political affairs of Nicaragua, their action will not meet with approval of the Department of the State. Lawrence Dennis, like Chamorro, was a very stubborn man. During the next few weeks, he sent a barrage of cables and letters to the State Department, detailing his efforts to oust Chamorro and making numerous requests for stronger American action. He also put direct pressure on the Nicaraguan president, phoning him every day to ask when he was going to resign and missing no opportunity to make clear that the department's position and he could never hope for American recognition. While the American charge was trying to persuade Chamorro to resign, the liberals resumed their use of military force to achieve the same end. On the heavily settled west coast, a rebel force cut the railroad line between Chindanega and Leon. On August 20th, this liberal force, now numbering 900 men, reached the port of Tamarindo, where they expected to find arms being shipped to them from Mexico. Instead, they found a government army led by General Alfonso Estrada, who attacked and routed them, captured their commander. Another liberal force succeeded in briefly capturing the town of San Marcos, but it was too easily scattered when government troops arrived in force. The commander of this force was an American educated and former toilet inspector and used car salesman named Anastasio Somoza Garcia. Known to his friends simply as Tacho, this erstwhile revolutionary fled into hiding after the defeat of his force, but emerged after a few days to accept a government pardon in return for his promise not to join any other subversive activities. Despite this rather ludicrous climax to his first military venture, quote unquote, Tacho Somoza was destined to become the dominant figure of 20th century Nicaraguan history. A few days after Somoza's defeat, a much more serious uprising occurred on the East Coast. Liberals seized Rio Grande north of Bluefields and would probably have captured Bluefields as well if Marines from the USS Galveston had not landed and declared the city a neutral zone. Undaunted by this setback, the liberal troops commanded by former War Minister Jose Maria Moncada extended their control over other areas of the East Coast, capturing Puerto Cabezas and driving the government forces inland to Rama. The strength of the liberal attack produced consternation and divisions within the Conservative Party, with demands that General Chamorro step down and some accommodation be sought with the liberals. The revolution was spreading, the regime was bankrupt, the negotiations seemed to offer the only way out. Even General Chamorro was forced to admit that his regime's financial situation could hardly be worse. By September, the conflict had already cost the government more than $1 million, and revenues were falling as costs soared. The general tried to sell the National Bank and the National Railroad, but he could find no buyers, perhaps because former Vice President Sacasa, the liberal political leader, declared that any such sale would not be recognized if he should obtain power. The financial problems, the liberal revolt, splits within his own party, and determined American opposition, personified in Lawrence Dennis, finally proved too much even for Chamorro. Early in September, he asked for a truce conference under American supervision, following which, regardless of the results obtained, be agreed to turn over the presidential power to his designate selected by Congress. It took almost a month to make preparations for the conference, but on October 15, 1926, a 15-day truce was declared, and representatives of both sides began discussion on board the USS Denver in Corinto Harbor. All factions soon agreed that Chamorro must go, but no agreement could be reached on his replacement or on the division of the government positions between the two parties. Adolfo Diaz, whom the conservatives, with support from Dennis, advocated as interim president, was unacceptable to the liberals. When the liberals' insistence that Sacasa be recognized as legal president, he rejected the conservatives. With the liberals expecting aid from Mexico and the conservatives hoping for American support, the conference became deadlocked and on October 24th broke up without ending the war. Chamorro now resigned the presidency to the congressional designate, Senator Sebastian Urizo. At the urging of Dennis and the State Department, the Nicaraguan Congress went through the motions of reinstating its 21 liberal members expelled by Chamorro. But since most were in exile or engaged in the fighting, only 3 members and 6 alternatives took their seats. Still following Dennis's recommendations, which were strongly supported by Secretary of State Kellogg, this reorganized Congress then selected Adolfo Diaz as first designate, and Urizo promptly turned over executive power to him. Diaz was inaugurated on November 14th, with Dennis playing a conspicuous role in the ceremony. He was granted formal recognition by the United States 3 days later. American support for Diaz failed to curb the liberals' determination to drive the conservatives from power. Sacasa landed at Puerto Cabezas and proclaimed himself constitutional president of Nicaragua. His government was promptly recognized by Mexico. In an effort to halt the liberal advance, President Diaz turned to the United States, requesting a loan, supplies, and military mission to rebuild the National Guard. While unwilling to send a military mission in the midst of a revolution, the State Department did agree to consider granting to private dealers licenses for the shipment of arms and munitions to the Diaz government, a break in the earlier embargo policy, and expressed willingness to try to find another instructor for the Guard. Internally, Diaz moved quickly to consolidate his control over the government. General Chamorro had taken command of the army when Diaz became president, but he and Diaz soon quarreled, and the president, supported by Dennis, pressured him into diplomatic exile as Minister of France, Great Britain, Spain, Italy, and the Vatican. Diaz also removed Major Carter and several other American instructors from the Guard because of their suspected pro-Chamorro views. Finally, the Nicaraguan president requested the return of American legation guard to Managua. When Minister Eberhard, who returned to his post at the end of 1926, and the British and Italian governments joined in the request, Secretary Kellogg gave his assent. A landing party from the USS Galveston arrived on the capital on January 6, 1927, and were welcomed by the Nicaraguan government as deliverers of the threat of a liberal victory. The American decision to support the Diaz regime was justified in part by repeated State Department charges of Mexican and communist support for Somoza and the liberals. On January 2nd, 1927, using phrases strikingly similar to those advanced in later years to justify American intervention in Vietnam. Undersecretary of State Robert Olds wrote a confidential memorandum summarizing American policy goals in Nicaragua. Olds argued as follows: the Central American area down to and including the Isthmus of Panama constitutes a legitimate sphere of influence for the United States. If we are to have due regard for our own safety and protection, our ministers accredited to the 5 little republics stretching from Mexican border to Panama have been advisors whose advice have been accepted virtually as law. We do control the destinies of Central America, and we do so for the simple reason that the national interest absolutely dictates such a course. There is no reason for any outside influence other than ours in this region. We could not tolerate such a thing without incurring grave risks. At this moment, a deliberate attempt to undermine our position and set aside our special relationship in Central America is being made. The action of Mexico and Nicaraguan crisis is a direct challenge to the United States. We must decide whether we shall tolerate the interference of any other power, for example, Mexico, in Central America affairs, or insist upon our own dominant position. If the Mexican maneuvers succeed, it will take many years to recover the ground we shall have lost. Until now, Central America has always understood that governments which negotiate, recognize, and support stay in power, while those we do not recognize and support fall. Nicaragua has become a test case. It is difficult to see how we can afford to be defeated. While determined to prevent a liberal victory, Secretary of State Kellogg still hoped to avoid full-scale intervention. Non-military efforts to end the revolt took many forms. President Diaz attempted direct negotiation with the liberals. Somoza seemed willing to allow the presidency to go to some third party, but this conflicted with the State Department's insistence on retaining Diaz in order to prevent a Mexican triumph. The department did manage to assist Diaz in obtaining 2 loans totaling $1,300,000 from American sources, but money alone could not save the conservative cause. As a last resort, the Nicaraguan president suggested a formal treaty of alliance between his government and the United States, but the State Department wanted nothing to do with this idea. On the military front, conservative fortunes continued to decline. Early in February, a liberal army occupied the west coast city of Chandanaga. Government troops, aided by 2 American aviators, eventually drove them out, but much of the city was destroyed in the process. Meanwhile, the American force in Nicaragua was rapidly built up, and the number of neutral zones in the country was greatly increased. By March 15, 1927, there were over 2,000 sailors and Marines on duty in Nicaragua. They controlled not only the port cities of Bluefields and Corinto, but also the liberal centers of Leon and Chindonaga, the highland city of Matagalpa, and had 12 officers and 141 men occupying La Loma in Managua. A sailor on duty in Nicaragua summed up the situation by stating, "It was obvious that we had not arrived to declare the various towns neutral. The liberals would have swept the conservatives out of control in short order." Early in March, a final effort to negotiate an end to the war failed, foundering on the perennial issue of the retention of Diaz in office until after the 1928 election. The country headed toward near anarchy, with armed bands of deserters from both sides terrorizing the population. The prolonged fighting had led to an abandonment of the fields and the crops, which had to be in the end of June, which would be lost if the war did not end by then. The United States decided at this point to send a special presidential representative to Nicaragua to attempt to resolve the situation. For this vital mission, the president selected former Secretary of War Henry Stimson, who had previously served on special missions to report on the Tacna-Arica dispute between Chile and Peru and to observe conditions in the Philippines. His experience with the Taka-Arica issue had convinced Colonel Stimson that the only outside supervision could ensure a fair election in much Latin America, while the Philippines had been impressed with the creation of a native constabulary force trained and led by American officers. These experiences helped shape his approach to the Nicaraguan situation. On April 7, 1927, President Calvin Coolidge and Secretary of State Kellogg met with Stimson to discuss the Nicaraguan mission. Coolidge refused to negotiate the retention of Diaz as president, but was willing to risk a liberal victory in American supervised elections in 1928. Stimson was given wide authority to negotiate settlement. If his efforts failed and Sakasa could not be stopped in any other way, it was agreed that the United States would then undertake full-scale intervention, primarily to save face by not letting the world think that Mexico had been more influential in deciding the outcome of the revolution. Stimson sailed from New York on April 9th, arriving in Nicaragua 6 days later. He immediately began a rapid round of conferences with all those he felt might shed some light on the Nicaraguan situation. In his first conference, Admiral Latimer, commander of the Special Surface Squadron, the naval unit stationed in the area, told him that he saw only two possibilities acceptable to the United States: a victory for Diaz, which he felt quite unlikely, or open intervention. Stimson, however, was determined to find another alternative and began conferring with leaders of both Nicaraguan political parties. The subject of the reorganized National Guard was a major theme in many of his conversations. Dr. Aguado, a leading liberal, approved the idea of an American officer constabulary. L.S. Rosenthal, the American manager of the National Bank, advocated the creation of a force led by American officers on active duty and the stationing of this force in small detachments throughout the country. Stimson also met with Major Rodriguez, the American who had succeeded Major Carter as commander of the National Guard. Rodriguez told Stimson that a force of at least 1,500 men costing $1 million annually was necessary to maintain peace in Nicaragua. By April 21st, Stimson had drawn up what he felt would be an acceptable peace terms. This included immediate peace, a general amnesty, inclusion of liberals in the cabinet, disarmament of both sides with the arms turned over to the Americans, retention of the Marines in Nicaragua until a new National Guard was formed to replace them, the organization of a nonpartisan National Guard under American officers, and American supervision of the 1928 elections. The following day, President Diaz signed a peace agreement incorporating these points. The government was now definitely committed to an American supervised peace, but getting the liberals to agree remained a difficult task. Stimson concentrated his efforts on General Moncada and his officers and generally ignored the Sakasa government. Among those who met with Stimson was General Anastasio Somoza Garcia. Somoza's suggestion that Solorzano be returned to the presidency made no impression on Stimson, but the personally and fluent English of the young liberal eventually did. The colonel noted in his diary, "Somoza is a very frank, friendly, likable young liberal, and his attitude impresses me more favorably than almost any other." As a result of his favorable impression, Stimson took Somoza with him for a few days to assist in interpreting for his other meetings. This would not be the last time, quote, Tacho's command of English and his ability to ingratiate himself with influential Americans would serve him in good stead. In final preparation for talks with General Moncada, Stimson obtained State Department permission to use American military force to prevent Moncada's troops from crossing the Tipitapa River. This served final notice on the liberals that the United States would not allow them to defeat Diaz, leaving them only the choice of defeat or accepting American terms. Moncada and Stimson met under a large blackthorn tree on May 4th, 1927. The American representative carefully separated the Nicaraguan general from Sacasa's political representatives who were still steadfastly opposed to the retention of Diaz and conferred with him in private. Given the choice of agreeing to the proposed terms or fighting the United States, Moncada agreed to recommend that Sacasa yield to avoid bloodshed. At the time of this meeting, Moncada did manage to persuade Simpson to agree to the appointment of liberal jefes politicos, some of whom were to be former officers in his army in the liberal departments. On May 5th, Moncada told his troops that he had agreed to Simpson's terms, and the same day President Diaz proclaimed the general amnesty. It seemed as if Simpson's mission had succeeded in restoring peace to Nicaragua. Government forces soon retired to the south, and the Americans occupied a line along the Titapapa River, placing themselves in a position to disarm both sides. Admiral Latimer announced that his forces would collect the rifles and machine guns held by both armies, and that the Nicaraguan government would pay Ren Cordobas for each serviceable weapon turned in. Thus, not turning in their weapons voluntarily would be forcibly disarmed. Those not turning in their weapons voluntarily would be forcibly disarmed. Stimson sent Moncada his personal letter pledging American supervision of the 1928 election and the assignment of American officers to train and command the National Constabulary. On May 12th, Moncada and all but one of his generals assigned Stimson's peace terms and agreed to disarm. General Augusto Cesar Sandino denounced this agreement, but Stimson attached little importance to his opposition, noting it in a message to the State Department, but concluding that the agreement of the other generals marked definitely the end of the insurrection. The American representative had badly underestimated the courage and determination of General Sandino. With the disarmament proceeding rapidly and smoothly, Stimson took leave of Nicaragua on May 16th, noting in his diary for that date to his belief that the Marine force in the country could be safely reduced to 1,000 men. These, he believed, would have to remain until after the 1928 election, but by then the new Guardia Nacional should be fully organized and functioning, eliminating any possible reason for the retention beyond that date. Minister Eberhard also felt that the peace had been restored. On May 26, he cabled the State Department promising Admiral Latimer and General Phelan, the Marine commander, of having effected a wonderful disarmament with a minimum of bloodshed and friction. A total of 11,600 rifles and 303 machine guns had been turned in, but General Sandino refused to surrender his arms. He was, however, reported heading for the Honduran border with only 200 men. The major task now facing the United States in Nicaragua seemed to be supervising the 1928 elections and reorganizing and training the new National Guard. So that's it. That's chapter 4, I think it's chapter 2, Major Carter's Constabulary. So let's, make some points. So Major Carter, so American, again, it's meddling. It's the American meddling in the internal affairs of Nicaragua. They are rapists and murderous butchers of the U.S. government. We see their rapists and murderous butchers, action over and over again in Nicaragua. Major Carter came in. Solorzano, President Solorzano was in charge. He was, the man in charge. Carter, Major Carter, which was a constabulary, was, there. He was, in favor of Solorzano, but there were some major issues. There was some major attacks between each other. The Marines continued to sail. General Chamorro was actually put in power. General Chamorro took power. He had a big force. He basically said that we're going to take power. General Chamorro took power of the government. The American government refused to recognize General Chamorro's government. Typical United States, violent white rapists and murderous butchers. Their U.S. Army are violent white rapists and murderous butchers, as are their U.S. Congress and U.S. President. And they did this, they took power. Chamorro took power. And then Eberhard said that basically, they will not recognize, General Chamorro. It was clear that we will not recognize the government of General Chamorro. They made that statement. So subsequent to that, Major Carter, basically sympathized with all the efforts of Solorzano, but, ultimately, the United States force, the sending of the Guard into battle against the liberals was simply the last in a long series of events which ended in the high hopes once held by the United States for this force. Ultimately, the American minister was recalled from Nicaragua, and a young legation secretary, Lawrence Dennis, became in charge. Since the United States would not recognize Chamorro, Dennis decided that it was his task to remove the general from office. So basically the U.S., it's, destabilization of Nicaragua in the 1920s. This is actually in 1927. They were destabilizing Nicaragua. In 1927, they were interested in destabilizing Nicaragua. Lawrence Dennis was, legation secretary. He said that his job was to remove Chamorro. The State Department, basically was in concert with, Lawrence Dennis's statements. So Lawrence Dennis was also a very stubborn man, and he sent many cables and letters to the State Department detailing his efforts to oust Chamorro, making numerous requests for stronger American action. He put direct pressure on the Nicaraguan president, phoning him every day to ask when he was going to resign. So he was, harassing General Chamorro. The typical thing, the U.S. white rapists and murderous butchers of its Congress, its president, its army, and its public in its vicious campaign in the third world in Nicaragua. So continuing on, basically, so the idea was to oust General Chamorro, a few days after Somoza. So then we learned first about General Somoza, used car salesman and former toilet inspector, was Anastasio Somoza Garcia, or Tacho. He was basically, he was a revolutionary, fled into hiding, after the defeat of his force, but emerged after a few days to accept government pardon to return to his promise not to join any other subversive activities. Despite this rather ludicrous climax to the first military venture, Tacho Somoza was destined to become the dominant figure in 20th century Nicaraguan history. So that's the first time we introduced Somoza. All right. And then there was an East Coast uprising, and, liberals seized the Rio Grande north of Bluefields, and, basically undermined by the Sith-backed liberal troops commanded by former War Minister Jose Maria Moncada, extended their control over other areas of the East Coast, capturing Puerto Cabezas and driving government forces inland to Lama. There was consternation within the divisions of the Conservative Party and demands that Chamorro step down and that some accommodation be sought with the Liberals. So you can see the U.S. was fomenting unrest against Somoza by instilling, attacks by the Liberals. It's clear that, the U.S. government, the white rapists and murderous white butchers of the U.S. Army and their, politicians, fomented, over and over unrest against the regime. So continuing on, we saw that Chamorro, Chamorro Adolfo Diaz, was with the support of Dennis, advocated as interim president, was unacceptable. But Chamorro now resigned the presidency to the congressional delegate. At the urging of Dennis, the State Department Nicaraguan Congress went through the motions of reinstating its 21 liberal members expelled by Chamorro. But since most were in exile or engaged in fighting, only 3 members and 6 alternates took their seats. So, they were, Secretary of State Kellogg was the Secretary of State that was, urging, Chamorro to step down. American support for Diaz failed to curb the liberals' determination to drive the conservatives from power. Sacasa landed at Port Cabeza and proclaimed himself constitutional president of Nicaragua. His government was promptly recognized by Mexico. So you can see Sacasa was recognized by Mexico. The U.S., meddlers, they're destabilizing meddlers. Who is the United States government to involve itself in a country in Latin America? Who are they to be involved in Latin American and Hispanic politics? They're a group of white rapists, murderous butchers of the U.S. government. That's ultimately what we see. So finally, President Diaz turned to the United States, requesting a loan, supplies, and military mission to rebuild the National Guard. While unwilling to send a military mission in the midst of the revolution, the State Department did agree to consider granting to private dealers licenses for shipment of arms and munitions from the Diaz government. So continuing on. So then we see finally that Robert Olds, the Nicaraguan policy. He gives us a little information on what the Nicaraguan policy is. The Central American policy, including the Isthmus, legitimate sphere of influence, and use of the Monroe Doctrine. The racist, rapists, and murderous white butchers employing the Monroe Doctrine to rape and murder people in the third world. They're rapists, murderous butchers and rapists of the U.S. government. They, employed the Monroe Doctrine, He explained it with the similar to the American intervention in Vietnam. It seems like the same kind of policies, the same vicious policies, why the white supremacists, rapists, and murderous butchers of third world people of the U.S. government over and over again, they continue their action here. He said that basically we have to accept at face value that Mexico has no business getting involved in, Nicaraguan politics. So it seems to me more clear that Mexico should be more involved than the rapists of the U.S. government, the rapists and white murderous butchers of the United States government. They have no business to be involved in Latin American politics. They are vicious thugs. So, while we must decide whether we shall tolerate interference of any other power, for example, Mexico in Central American affairs, or insist upon our own dominant positions, if this Mexican maneuver succeeds, it will take many years to recover the ground we shall have lost. Okay, and it is difficult to see if we can afford to be defeated. So again, Robert Olds, Secretary of State, Undersecretary of State Robert Olds, in 1927, described this. And finally, we get back to Stimson. So Stimson became good friends of Somoza. Stimson is, Franklin Roosevelt, Secretary of State, Stimson. He became friends with Somoza, Anastasio Garcia Somoza. So again, the rapists and murderous white butchers of Franklin Roosevelt, becoming friends with this, nasty dictator, this rapist and murderous butcher of the U.S. government. And that's what it is. Ultimately, Somoza's suggestion that Solorzano be returned to the presidency made no impression on Stimson, but the personality and fluent English of the young liberal evidently did. So fluent English is important for Hispanic countries' democracy. Fluent English is how the United States should establish Hispanic countries' democracy. They're rapists and murderous butchers of the U.S. government, mafia thugs and mafia murderous butchers of the American government. So that's it. We finished that chapter. So at the end, in summary, we learned about Somoza, and then we're going to continue. Next chapter, the Guardia Reborn. The first commander of the new Guardia Nacional de Nicaragua National Guard was Colonel Robert Rhea of the United States Marine Corps. His first task was to decide what to do with the 295 enlisted men, 65 of whom were absent without leave, who still remained in the old constabulary. In order to prevent any complications that might arise from previous political ties, that body was disbanded and all of its men discharged. Several immediately enlisted in the new Guardia Nacional, thereby providing a certain measure of continuity between the two organizations. Recruiting for the Guardia began on May 24th, 1927. Within months, 3 companies had been organized. At this point, Colonel Rhea, who was in poor health, was replaced by Colonel Elias Beadle, who was given the Nicaraguan rank of Brigadier General and title Jefe Director de la Guardia Nacional de Nicaragua. During its first months, it is difficult to determine under what authority the Guardia operated or from where it obtained its funds. The conscious effort of the United States to separate the new Guardia from the former constabulary made the laws relating to that body of doubtful application. The Stimson agreements signed by Diaz and Moncada did provide for the creation of constabulary under American officers, but furnished no guidelines as to the size, budget, regulations, or organizations of that body. Finally, there was a memorandum sent by President Diaz to President Coolidge on May 15, 1927. This stated in part that the function of preserving law and order throughout the country shall be assumed by a national constabulary to be organized under the instruction and, so far as possible, the direction and command of American officers now in active service and detailed to this duty by the President of the United States. The memorandum also discussed future relations of the Guardia Nacional with election officials, but failed to include any guidelines for the day-to-day functioning of the organization. On May 8th, President Diaz had requested Coolidge to allow an American to be appointed as commander of the Guardia. The officer appointed by Coolidge was to select additional instructors. Diaz evidently expected that these would include both Nicaraguans and Americans. The Nicaraguan president also preferred Army to Marine instructors. At first, Stimson expressed some support for this position, but both Admiral Latimer and Brigadier General Logan Phelan, commander of the Marine Brigade in Nicaragua, strongly opposed such a course. with Latimer reportedly declaring that this would reflect upon the honor of the Marine Corps. Stimson decided not to press the point, and the Marines began to assign officers to the Guardia. The case with which Diaz's wishes were ignored clearly illustrates the complete control that the United States had assumed over the Guardia's development. For several months, the Nicaraguan government's role was limited to issuing decrees requested by the United States and paying the Guardia's bills. The amount which the Nicaraguans had to pay was increased by the Marines' insistence that officers detailed to the Guardia receive a salary from the Nicaraguan government, in addition to their regular Marine pay. The American minister Charles Eberhard objected to this proposal, arguing that any extra compensation should come from the American sources, a position which General Phelan dismissed as absurd. Ultimately, the Marines' position, which was supported by both Stimson and Admiral Latimer, won acceptance. Officers received the salary from the Nicaraguan government corresponding to their rank in the Guardia. Nicaraguan salaries were lower than those in the Marine Corps, but since the most Americans held a rank in the Guardia, one or more grades above the ranks in the Corps, the extra compensation often amounted to nearly double pay. On June 18, 1927, President Diaz issued his first decree relating to the Guardia Nacional. This established a pay scale for officers ranging from $250 a month for the Jefe director down to $60 a month for second sub-district commanders. On July 8th, Diaz authorized the Guardia's Marine commander to increase his force strength to 600 men and to appoint Navy and Marine officers to non-comms as officers in numbers up to 7.5% of the enlisted strength. It was not until July 30th, 1927 that a detailed decree covering Guardia's duties, obligations, and legal procedures issued. This document included a provision for the gradual replacement of all police by the Guardia. Local authorities were to have no control over the Guardia, which was to be subject only to the president of Nicaragua. Except in purely civil cases, Nicaraguans in the Guardia could be tried only by court-martial, and the decision of these courts were subject only to a limited review by the Supreme Court. American officers would be subject to American non-Nicaraguan court-martial for any offenses they might commit, until the signing of a formal agreement between the United States and Nicaragua in December 1927. This decree provided all the official authority that the Guardia had. The continued presence of Sandino's armed band in the mountains of western Nicaragua brought the Guardia into military action long before its legal status were resolved. Until his decision to resist the American intervention, Sandino had been virtually unknown outside of Nicaragua and not too well known within this nation. He was born in Nicaragua in 1895, the illegitimate son of a local landowner and a young Indian girl. In 1920, following a fight in which he was wounded a man, he fled the country, eventually arriving in Mexico. He worked in the oil fields around Tampico, became a Freemason, and was impressed by the nationalism of the Mexican Revolution and its glorification of the nation's Indian heritage. He returned to Nicaragua in 1926, just before the liberal revolt against Chamorro began. In the ensuing conflict, Sandino rose rapidly, becoming one of Moncada's leading generals. He was, however, still only one of many liberal generals. Most of them returned to relative obscurity after Stimson's agreements. Sandino's motives for defying the United States were not due to anti-Americanism. Often he expressed respect for the American people. He came from a strong liberal background and was extremely irritated to see conservative puppets imposed upon the people by American intervention. The Marines, for obvious reasons, characterized him as a bandit, but Nicaraguan and Latin American intellectuals in general looked upon him as a noble patriot, fighting against, quote, Yankee aggression. Sandino's first public proclamation of his decision to continue fighting was directed much more against Diaz and the conservatives than against American intervention. He even suggested what Moncada had previously suggested, namely that as an alternative to keeping Diaz in office, the United States should establish an American military government in Nicaragua until the 1928 elections. The Americans were in fact dominant, and Sandino was against the hypocrisy of hiding this behind a puppet president. When the proposal was rejected, Sandino began publicly to denounce the American presence in Nicaragua. This is not to imply that that strong patriotic sentiments did not influence Sandino's actions. It is only to suggest that while Sandino had in the last few years become aware of the threat of imperialism at the time of his rebellion, he was still more of a liberal fighting the conservatives for the constitutional rights of his party. The change to a patriot fighting for the sovereignty of his country came gradually. Since the Americans helped keep the hated conservatives, or after 1928, the liberal quote-unquote traitor Moncada in power, Sandino had to fight the Americans. The experience of years of guerrilla conflict led him to believe that the greater problem was American imperialism, and he was eagerly seized upon as a symbol of the anti-imperialist cause throughout Latin America. Sandino's motives, however, came much more from understanding the Nicaraguan situation than from any a priori commitment to international anti-imperialist movement. Following the Stimson agreements, Sandino retired into the isolated, mountainous, and thinly settled department of Nueva Segovia. Shortly thereafter, the 1st Marine Detachment, commanded by Major Harold Pierce and Captain Gilbert Hatfield, entered the department, escorting the newly appointed liberal Jefe Politiso to the department capital of Ocotal. They reached Ocotal on June 9th and quickly disarmed both the liberal garrison and a conservative force which had been operating in the area. Pierce intended to spend only a few days in Ocotal, but a new Jefe Politica, who was terrified of Sandino, vowed that if the Marines pulled out, he would leave with them. The Marines were therefore ordered to remain and were kept supplied by aviators operating out of Managua. On June 13th, Major Pierce and most of his men left Ocotal for Matagalpa, but Captain Hatfield and 10 enlisted men remained behind to garrison the town. Sandino and Hatfield now began exchanging telegraph messages, alternating insults and challenges with political philosophy from Sandino and offers to negotiate from Hatfield. In his final message promising to attack Ocotal, Sandino signed himself, "Your most obedient servant, who ardently desires to put you in a handsome tomb with a beautiful bouquet of flowers." In between telegrams, Sandino found the time to issue his first political manifesto. In this document, he denounced Moncada as a traitor to drive the Americans out of Nicaragua and the conservatives out of power, and then threw in a plea for Latin American construction of a Nicaraguan canal. By late June, the inability of the Marines to disarm Sandino began to alarm some American officials, and plans were hurriedly made to reinforce the Ocotal garrison. On July 1st, the 3 American officers and 50 Nicaraguans, enlisted men of the newly created 1st Company of the Guardia Nacional, left Managua, arriving in Ocotal a few days later. That same week, Phelan sent Major General Lejeune, the Marine Corps commandant, his proposals for dealing with Sandino, while still entertaining hopes that the rebel leader was only trying to accumulate as much money as possible and then slip out of the country. He also noted that Sandino gave every appearance as a fanatic. Referring to the dispatch of the Guardia to reinforce Ocotal, Phelan noted that his force contained a good proportion of old men, probably a reference to veterans of the original constabulary. A force of provisional Guardia made up largely of veterans of the old conservative army had also been enlisted for the task of patrolling Nueva Segovia until more regular Guardia were trained. Phelan expressed confidence that these preparations would allow the withdrawal of the Marines to proceed as planned, but he admitted there was a very unlikely possibility that Sandino might infect the entire country and cause serious trouble. 8 days later, Sandino transforming this unlikely possibility into a most unpleasant reality. The 5.5-year conflict between Sandino and the Guardia Nacional began on July 16, 1927, when Sandino attacked the garrison in Ocotal. The battle lasted from 1:15 in the morning until 5 a.m. the following afternoon. After the initial charges were repulsed, the Sandinistas surrounded the city hall and Guardia barracks where the defenders had barricaded themselves and kept a steady exchange of rifle and machine gun fire. Strafing attacks by Marine patrol planes, followed by further attacks by 5 de Havilland bombers sent from Managua, finally broke the back of the attack and drove the remnants of the rebel force back into the mountains. Only one defender, a Marine, was killed in the engagement. 1 Marine and 3 Guardia were wounded, and the 4 National Guardia had been captured. Captain Hatfield estimated Sandino's losses at 300. His first attack had resulted in a costly defeat, due largely to 2 important factors. Firstly, the Sandinistas were poorly trained and equipped, with only 60 of the men reportedly being armed with rifles. The other factor was the activity of Marine aircraft, something which Sandino admittedly had completely omitted from his pre-battle calculations. The defeat was costly, but the guerrilla leader learned from his mistakes. After Alcatel, he concentrated on ambushes and sudden raids instead of open attacks on a strong and fortified enemy. The attack on Alcatel on a July 29th presidential decree ordering the Guardia to assume police duties throughout the nation created an urgent need to recruit and train additional troops. Several factors, however, including disbelief based on long experience that a Nicaraguan government would pay soldiers a regular salary, political pressures in some areas to discourage prospective enlistees, and the high wages available during the coffee harvesting season combined to hamper recruiting efforts. Many of those who were recruited failed to meet Guardia standards. Out of one group of 20 recruits in early August, only 11 passed their physical examinations. Since traditionally any male with 2 arms, 2 legs, and a warm body was considered suitable army material, the idea of rejecting men who wanted to join represented a definite break with earlier Nicaraguan military practices. Despite such problems, the Guardia grew steadily, and by August 27th, 2 additional companies had taken up post in Tindanega and Esteli. Lack of funds was a continuing problem. Budgetary provisions for the Guardia did not begin until July 1st, 1927, when the Jeffy director was given $75,000 from a $1 million loan Nicaragua had obtained from an American banking firm and $40,000 from the surplus of official revenues collected by the High Commission. An additional $60,000 was allotted to the Guardia from the regular War Department budget, giving it a total of $175,000 to cover its expenses from July 1st, 1927 until January 1st, 1928. This sum could not support a force large enough to replace the regular army and also take over all police duties without the added costs of combat operations against Sandino. Continuing funding problems for the Guardia increased American concern over the prospects for successfully supervising the 1928 elections. The intricacies of Nicaraguan politics made it apparent that while Marines could maintain order, they could not prevent abuses of power and intimidation by the local police authorities during the campaign. To remedy this situation, it was necessary to replace all local police with Guardia units. By October 1927, he appeared that only $200,000, providing for a force of 600 men, would be available for the first 6 months of 1928. Adequate electoral supervision would require a force of at least 1,100 Guardia, supported by an annual budget of $689,000. To raise this money, Diana Munro, the American charge, suggested another loan to Nicaragua and a revision of the 1920 financial agreement to allow the government to increase its budget. Sandino's activities, however, soon made even the sum entirely too small, and for years the State Department struggled to obtain additional funds. This issue was further complicated by the conflicts over ratification of basic agreement for the establishment of the Guardia Nacional. Although the treaty formally establishing the Guardia was signed by Dana Munro and Carlos Cuadro Pazos, the Nicaraguan foreign minister, neither of these individuals played a major role in determining the terms of the agreement. This was done largely through correspondence between Generals Lejeune and Phelan of the Marine Corps. By the end of July 1927, General Phelan presented a draft of the treaty to President Diaz for his approval. Meanwhile, the State Department had obtained a copy from the Navy Department and, finding it satisfactory, authorized the American minister to sign it if the text remained basically the same. While the State Department found the treaty satisfactory, the Nicaraguans did not, and in late summer, the Diaz administration proposed several major changes in the agreement affecting the very nature of the Guardia. The Nicaraguan proposed to fill the ranks through compulsory military service rather than voluntary enlistments, arguing that failure to do so might contribute to the rise of a professional military caste and to create separate forces for military and police functions. The American legation rejected both of these proposals, claiming that both voluntary enlistments and combined military and police functions were necessary to create a non-political force and prevent intimidation and fraud in the 1928 election. On both these points, the legation's view prevailed, providing another illustration of the final control exercised by the United States in the development of the National Guard. After further discussions with the Nicaraguan government and minor changes in the working of the treaty, portions of the completed but as yet unsigned document were published in Nicaragua's leading conservative newspaper. The National Legal Directorate of the Conservative Party quickly approved the proposed agreement, but General Chamorro and his supporters within the party did everything they could to prevent ratification by the Nicaraguan Senate. The objective of these efforts was to prevent the Guardias replacing all local police forces, thereby allowing conservative controlled police to influence the results of the 1928 elections. In order to muster support for his efforts, General Chamorro concentrated his criticism on the clause exempting American officers from the jurisdiction of Nicaraguan courts. Monroe repeated American insistence upon this point, adding a scarcely veiled threat of disastrous consequences to the Conservative Party of any open conflict with the government of the United States over measures considered necessary to make good our promises of both parties here. While the conservatives were divided over the issue of the Guardia, most liberals, led by General Moncada, supported the proposed treaty. They recognized that their hopes for victory in the 1928 elections depended on Marine and Guardia supervision to prevent the traditional frauds practiced by the party in power. The liberals even suggested that the Guardia agreement run for the period of 12 years, with American training and leadership continuing throughout this period. Secretary of State Kellogg rejected this request, pointing out that such a long-range commitment did not conform to American policy in Nicaragua. Explaining this position, he wrote, "The Guardia Agreement has for its sole object the creation of an efficiently organized Nicaraguan constabulary, primarily to ensure supervision of the forthcoming election and secondarily to guarantee general order and stability for the future. It looks to the establishment of a strictly Nicaraguan constabulary as soon as such a result can be accomplished with the aid and advice of American officers detailed for the purpose. These officers to be withdrawn as Nicaraguans are trained to take their places. The idea of any permanent offering of the constabulary is quite foreign to the fundamental objective of the agreement and is indeed inconsistent therewith. To fix any definite period of long duration, as is now proposed, would simply encourage critics of both governments to claim that something in the nature of military occupation of Nicaragua by the United States is in contemplation." The signing of this long, detailed, and controversial document finally took place on December 22nd, 1928. It provided for American organization of a force of 93 officers and 1,136 enlisted men with an annual budget of $700,000. Recognizing that Sandino's activities might make this force totally inadequate, provision was made for possible future increases in both strength and budget, noting that the figures specified in this agreement shall be regarded as the minimum requirements for the Guardia Nacional de Nicaragua. In line with American demands, the Guardia Nacional was declared to be the sole military and police force of the Republic and was given control of all arms and ammunition in Nicaragua. It also inherited control of all fortifications, barracks, buildings, grounds, penitentiaries, vessels, and other government property controlled by the old police or armed forces. Great powers were given to the Jeffy director, who, subject to presidential approval, controlled recruiting, appointment, instruction, training, promotion, examination, discipline, operation of troops, clothing, rations, arms and equipment, quarters, and administration, and who also issued all Guardia rules and regulations. Other sections of the agreement exempted American officers from the jurisdiction of Nicaraguan courts and provided for the appointment by the President of the United States of American officers to serve with the Guardia until Nicaraguans were trained to replace them. The signing of the Monroe Quadro Passes Agreement failed to bring an end to the controversy surrounding the organization and legal status of the Guardia. While ratification was easily achieved in the Nicaraguan Senate, a dispute in the Chamber of Deputies tied up the bill for the remainder of the Diaz administration. When the Liberals assumed power in 1929, their attitude toward the Guardia underwent a striking change, and the United States found itself faced with another, even more complex set of problems concerning its role in the creation of that force. While the failure to complete formal ratification bothered the State Department, it had little effect on the Marines' day-by-day development of the Guardia. They continued to recruit and to spend funds as if the legal basis for such actions were fully established. On October 1st, 1927, the Guardia had 47 officers and 438 men stationed in 4 departments: Esteli, Nueva Segovia, Chindanega, and Managua. Spurred on by the fighting against Sandino and by pressure of preparing for the 1928 elections, recruitment and training went rapidly in the following year. By September 30th, 1928, there were 173 officers and 1,637 enlisted men, a force already nearly 50% in excess of that provided for in the Munro Quadros Pazos agreement, and this force was distributed throughout virtually every department in the nation. The organization and training of the new Guardia Nacional produced a wide variety of problems for the Marines. The first problem came with the quality of the recruits. Guardia regulations provided that all recruits, except for apprentice musicians, had to be at least 18 years of age, pass a physical examination, and except in exceptional cases be able to read and write. Since literate Nicaraguans were rarely interested in enlisting as privates, this requirement soon had to be waived. The schools for illiterate soldiers were set up at some of the larger posts, and instructors were hired with the rank and pay of a corporal. The instructors did not have to wear uniforms and could quit after giving 15 days notice, a right naturally not extending to others enlisted men who served a term of 3 years. For several years, almost all of the Guardia's commissioned officers were Americans assigned to that duty by the Navy Department. The Nicaraguan government had virtually no voice in the selection of these men, who were shuttled in and out of the country as the interest of the Navy Department dictated. While some of the Marines had previous experiences training in constabulary forces in Haiti or the Dominican Republic, few spoke Spanish and had therefore to rely on interpreters and gestures to get the instructions understood. These are the American officers of the Marines. Officers assigned to Nicaraguan duty were rarely, if ever, given any prior orientation as to the culture, political situation, or even United States policy goals in the nation. Despite such handicaps, as well as the limitations on training that imposed by the demands of the campaigns against Sandino, the Marines did surprisingly well, transforming their raw recruits within a few months to the best trained, disciplined, and equipped forces in Nicaraguan history. While most of the Marines assigned to the Guardia had some previous experience in training troops, few had any background in directing the police functions which the Guardia was expected to undertake. Language and cultural barriers were also greater in this sensitive area, leading to a host of problems, and at times rather ingenious solutions were hardly imagined by the statesmen generals who drew up the original Guardia agreement. Some of these problems were described by the first Marine to serve as Managua's chief of police. The first few days were spent getting in touch with the old police force while it was run mostly by graft. That's corruption. I went to the Jeffy Politico and told him that I had to have forms and police blotters, and showed him by keeping an up-to-date record of offenses that I could get more money or fines for repeaters, as old records were impossible. We had to study upon existing police laws and how to cut through red tape to get convictions. I had 4 junior officers assigned who could read, write, and speak Spanish. To get the office going, we had to borrow, bum, and swipe what we needed. We were soon getting crowded for room. So I spoke it over with the police director. Well, he had to use what he had. I asked the Jeffy director for some intelligence money. I was allotted $30 monthly. I first got to work on the police director and see if I could get something on him officially or socially. Well, I got the goods on him that he was padding the payroll by pocketing the money that was for people who were supposed to work in his office, but they did only on paper. I called him in my office and we had a nice talk. The result was that he wrote a letter to the Minister of Police stating that he had discharged certain people, the ones on paper. I then proceeded to take more room. I immediately started schools and had the lieutenants go over the police laws then in force. The policeman was taught first to know what is wrong and then to know what to do about it. Their idea of the job was to lock everybody up they had a grudge against, or who would not turn over to them a little graft. Well, we had to weed out the undesirables at the start before we got a write-up in the papers. I held office hours each morning and the newspaper men at 10 a.m. We worked on the newspaper men and something and got something on them, and they left us alone. In the beginning, the police force was armed with a rifle and bayonet. We immediately discarded because we had several policemen cut by their own bayonets, as other people would interfere with the arrest. Take this weapon as both hands were busy holding the rifle and attack the policeman when his back was turned. We then had several cases where policemen were justified in shooting his rifle, but the bullet, after hitting the fugitive, would continue on and hit an innocent bystander, or continue on its flight and hit somebody sitting in his adobe home. We then turn to and arm them with clubs and pistols. I hope it is possible that you can put it across to have the Marine Corps get up a pamphlet and practice police work. I believe it should be part of the law course in the Marine Corps schools in Quantico. It is very important that when the Marines capture a place for the Navy in a foreign country, that we have officers competent to handle one of the most important functions of getting in touch with the natives. Also, in taking over a foreign city, allowance should be made for differences in race, customs, laws, language, and habits of the natives until they get used to us. The people were again against our methods at first because they could not bribe us to look blind or the other way. I used the lady next to the police station, Mrs. Irene de Pasos, to present our case to the President Diaz whenever we had to lock up some prominent conservative, or once in a while his nephew or his brother or his secretary. I had a complaint by some of the citizens one morning that there was no policeman on the streets at night, while my officers claimed that they had inspected the police force once every hour from midnight until 6 a.m. So I told that to the people, and they replied it could not be true, as if the policemen were on the job, they would blow their whistles all night and let the people know they were on the job. Well, I had to explain to the people that the police had orders not to blow their whistles until something happened that they needed assistance. Well, one cannot satisfy all the people. Some like to sleep. In outlying areas, the police also acted as judge and jury, combining police and judicial functions. They also exercised control over the jueces de mesta, a rough equivalent of American justices of the peace, and over jueces assistants, jefes de canton. Even Indian chiefs came under the Guardia's jurisdiction, as they traditionally exercised certain police and judicial functions. Other police duties included the control of all traffic in arms and explosive, the enforcement of sanitary regulations, the suppression of contraband, and the control of all traffic in liquor and tobacco. These last functions led in September 1928 to the Guardias replacing the Hacienda Treasury Department guards. These guards were described as very bad character and as more of a menace to peaceful communities than the outlaws they were supposed to operate against. Their elimination evoked no recorded protest. By taking over police functions, the Guardia also gained responsibility for all of the prisons in Nicaragua. Old prisons such as the National Penitentiary in Managua served as places of confinement and little else. Criminals, political prisoners, and the insane were locked up together under miserable conditions. Under the Marines, an effort was made to teach prisoners a trade. A furniture factory was established in the prison, cattle raising was introduced, and the institution became virtually self-supporting. Prisoners were allowed visitors on weekends, and church services were conducted. As part of the campaign to renovate the National Penitentiary, the entire building was painted green. Since green was the official color of the Conservative Party, and the painting was done after the Liberals' victory in the 1928 elections, the paint job produced a bumper crop of political jokes in Managua. In replacing the police, the Guardia Nacional assumed an immense task, one that inevitably led to mistakes, political involvements, and virulent criticism. But considering the handicaps under which they operated, the Guardia's Marine officers probably carried out the police duties as well as they could reasonably be expected. In fact, much of the criticism of their activities may have been due as much to the new efficiency which they introduced as it was to any failure of police duties. In Managua, the amount collected in fines jumped from $40 a month to over $500 when the Guardia replaced the municipal police. In Chontales, the local police made 14 arrests and conducted 3080 in fines in September 1927 through February 1928. They were later replaced by the Guardia, who from September 1928 to November 1928 made 334 arrests and collected $718 in fines, along with confiscating 132 rifles, 42 pistols, 53 shotguns, and 193 cutting weapons. Obviously, such increased efficiency did not make them popular with all segments of the population. The assumption of police duties influenced the Guardia's development in many ways. In order to carry out those duties and conjure to combat Sandino, it became necessary to create much larger force than originally anticipated. Ordinarily, Guardia assigned to police duties were not used on combat patrols, and those were assigned to combat patrols were not used on police duties. There was some rotation between these duties, but no fixed system in this regard. The assumption of police duties also complicated training procedures, since the same training did not fit a recruit to carry out both the police and combat duties. Original plans contemplated establishing a recruit depot in Managua to train all enlisted men, but this soon proved impractical. One of the first exceptions was made for the isolated Atlantic coast, where it soon became obvious that recruits would have to be raised and trained locally. Eventually, it became necessary to extend local recruitment and training to most areas of the nation of development, which made a good part of the local garrison natives of that area. Some rotation of troops from the post to post did take place, primarily because enlisted Guardia, following the Nicaraguan tradition of personalismo, often became too attached to their immediate Marine commander. Transfers were therefore instituted to get the rank and file used to serving loyally under different officers. Training was by no means the only area of traditional Nicaraguan military practice that was radically changed by the Americans, exhibiting a typical American drive for efficiency and modernization. The Marines made massive alterations in the areas of supply and communications. A quartermaster's department was established and made responsible for introducing standardization of arms, organizing a rudimentary system of motor transportation, creating formal dispersing and accounting sections, and establishing a regular system of uniforms. These efforts often encountered serious obstacles. For example, the horrible conditions of Nicaraguan roads limited the use of motor transport, at times forcing the Guardia to rely upon pack animals and ox carts. The Americans' lack of experience in handling transportation of this sort provided more than its share of headaches while Marines commanded the National Guard. While bull cars, native dugouts, and other primitive methods supplied much of the Guardia's transport capability, a vital contribution was made by the most modern means of transportation, the airplane. In August 1928 alone, 130,905 pounds of human and material cargo were flown from Managua to outlying Guardia posts, and even entire units were occasionally moved by air. Perhaps the best example of this was the airlifting the entire cadet corps of the Nicaraguan Military Academy in November 1931 from Managua to Esteli to combat the threatened attack by Sandino's forces. Establishing a functioning communication system brought another major problem. The existing Nicaraguan postal and telephone systems were bluntly described as unsatisfactory, and the telegraph service as only slightly less so. The only advantage of these systems was that they were all government owned and could therefore be used without having to expend additional funds from the constantly strained Guardia budget. The limitation of traditional communication system, including Sandino's constant destruction of telegraph and telephone lines, led the Marine efforts to establish a complete radio system between the Guardia posts. On December 22nd, 1931, this network, known as Radio Nacional, began the first continental radio service in Nicaraguan history with the inauguration of a station of the American-owned mining center of Bonanza. In September 1931, 20 Nicaraguans, enlisted men, were enrolled in a Guardia school for radio operators. 8 months later, 15 of them graduated and were assigned the duty as radio operators. Lack of time before the final Marine evacuation prevented organization of a second class, but while this left the Guardia a bit short-handed and experienced radio operators, the Marines had laid the basis for the most efficient communication system Nicaragua had ever known. Unfortunately, they had also left a heritage of military control over communications, a heritage which has continued up to the present. Not all the Americans attached to the Guardia were Marines. In the same way in which they provided health services for the Marines, officers of the Navy Hospital Corps developed medical services for the Guardia Nacional. Commander J.B. Helm, the Guardia's first medical director, ran into a host of problems. Nicaragua was hardly famous for its healthful climate on high morals. Syphilis was rampant, malaria, typhoid, dysentery, internal parasites, and tropical infections, combined with casualties suffered in combat with Sandino's forces, posed tremendous challenges for the Navy doctors. Much of Nicaragua was virtually devoid of doctors, hospitals, and sources of medical supplies. When he first took command of the medical department, Commander Helm tried to interest the Red Cross in Nicaraguan conditions, but got no response. Effort to obtain supplies from the Navy's Bureau of Medicine and Surgery gained no more success. Ultimately, Helms obtained $1,500 worth of goods from Medical Supply Depot in New York and received an additional $250 worth of medical supplies from the commander of the New York Naval Hospital. When Commander Helm took office, there were 3 Navy officers and 1 Nicaraguan doctor working with the Guardia. 3 more medical officers, a chief pharmacist mate, and 17 other pharmacist mates were added before the end of 1927. A school to train Nicaraguan as corpsmen was established, and by October 1st, 1928 had graduated 21 enlisted men and from its 3-month program. Those who completed the course received the regular private's pay plus an additional month, no small sum in Nicaragua. The medical personnel operated 2 hospitals, one in Managua and another in Ocotal, center of the most active combat area, and operated 6 infirmaries and numerous dispensaries throughout the nation. While these facilities were limited and often inadequate, they were far better than anything Nicaraguan soldiers had known before. Control of the venereal disease was one of the most difficult tasks confronting the medical department. The rate of infection among enlisted men was extremely high, and lectures on morality and about the danger of infection did nothing to reduce it. Even handing out prophylaxis kits did not reduce the rate of infection, a failure which the Guardia's medical director attributed to the fact that the enlisted men were using the concerns to polish their shoes. The medical director further noted, however, that even the most virulent infections didn't bother the Nicaraguan soldier, who seemed to accept them as a matter of course. In an effort to control this problem, control over prostitution was vested in the Guardia by a presidential decree issued on July 3rd, 1928. Prostitutes were required to register and were given weekly inspections. 4 special venereal hospitals were established, and by early 1929, officials claimed a drop of over 80% in the venereal disease among Guardia personnel. In addition, 68 prostitutes were reportedly cured. This report, however, was apparently overly optimistic. In 1932, the medical department reported prostitutes were no longer being treated and that 487 new cases of venereal disease had been contracted by enlisted men in the past year. Only malaria with 804 cases presented a more serious health problem. Efforts to aid nationwide immunization campaigns against smallpox and typhoid were considerably more successful. General Order 43-1921 9 ordered the Guardia to cooperate in a national smallpox vaccination campaign, adding, "The Guardia will not use physical force to compel any person to be vaccinated, but those who refuse vaccination will be taken before the director of the police." While these inducement refusals were probably quite rare, for a while Guardia doctors and corpsmen also made free medical treatment available to civilians in remote areas. From September 1927 through October 1928, 1,147 Nicaraguans received this free care, but shortly thereafter, lack of funds brought this program to an end. Regular pay, improved equipment, and medical care combined to make conditions for Guardia enlisted men much better than those of the average Nicaraguan. But despite these advantages, efforts at organization were constantly hindered by desertions and even occasional mutinies. From October 1st, 1928 through September 1929, 480 men deserted and 387 others were discharged out of a force of 1,846. As organizations and discipline within the Guardia improved, this problem declined. From October 1931 to September 1932. The size of the Guardia remained fairly constant, increasing only 2,234 to 2,307 enlisted men. In this time, 580 men were discharged, but only 116 deserted, making the desertion rate only fifth of what it has been 3 years earlier. From time to time, mutinies flared up in outlying posts. These never occurred in major centers, and no unit ever mutinied during combat with Sandino's forces. Neither was there any conspiracy against uniting mutinies in more than one area. There were a total of 11 mutinies during the years Marines commanded the Guardia Nacional. The first occurred on January 8, 1928 at Somotillo. Some of the post-15 enlisted men participated in an effort to kill the 3 officers, all Marines stationed there, following which they planned to join Sandino. Their plan misfired and 4 mutineers were killed in the ensuing fight while the rest scattered. A more successful mutiny occurred in 1929 at Telpacana, following the murder of an American officer by an enlisted man. Most of the garrison deserted, kidnapping 2 other Marine officers, both of whom eventually escaped and fleeing to Honduras. From April to June 1932, 3 major mutinies occurred, resulting in the death of several American officers and at least one case providing recruits and weapons for Sandino. The last of these was led by a Nicaraguan officer, the only case in which an officer participated in a mutiny. These uprisings probably reflected tensions building up within the Guardia over the continuing failure to eliminate Sandino, the upcoming presidential election, and the subsequent withdrawal of all the Marines from the Guardia and from Nicaragua. Despite syphilis, mutinies, desertions, and Sandino, the Marines managed by 1932 to develop an effective, disciplined armed force in Nicaragua. The great burden of this task fell upon junior officers and enlisted men of the Marine Corps, and most performed their duties remarkably well. After a period of service, with the Guardia, the Marines developed a genuine respect for the fighting qualities of the Nicaraguan soldiers and even something of an affection for the men serving under them. This attitude contributed to the relatively high morale among Guardia's enlisted men. Their life was hardly easy, but a private's pay of $12 a month was higher than that of a laborer in Managua. The addition of uniforms, medical benefits, and food allowances made enlistment even more attractive. Compared to the majority of his countrymen, the lot of the average Guardia was not bad at all, and he knew it. After its first year, the force never lacked recruits, and the clause in the Nicaraguan Constitution establishing conscription became a dead letter. The United States had three basic objectives in creating the Guardia Nacional. The first was to replace the former army and police with a disciplined, adequately trained, and equipped constabulary. The Marines made great strides in this direction, and 5.5 years they directed the Guardia. Had the achievement of technical and organizational improvements been the sole objective, the Guardia's creation would have been rated with some qualifications a major success. There were, however, two other objectives. The most pressing of these was establishing internal order by suppressing all uprising directed against the government from 1927 through 1932. This meant defeating Sandino, the final objective, and from the State Department's point of view, the dominant one was to transform Nicaragua's armed forces into a non-political force dedicated to defending constitutional order and guaranteeing free elections. On these last two objectives, the American record was to fall far short of success. Fighting Sandino or finding itself involved in a snare of political disputes, the Guardia encountered frustration piled upon frustration in the 1927 to 1933 period. Frustrations which ultimately spelled failure for American policies in both these vital areas. So that's it. That's the chapter, the Guardia Reborn. Let's make some comments here. So we see the white supremacists, the rapist white supremacists, and murderous butchers of the U.S. Army and their government, their politicians, conducted a campaign of slaughter in Nicaragua. We see the Guardia. We talked about the Guardia Reborn. We talked about, the formal agreements. The Guardia, the American officers were subject to American, not Nicaraguan court-martial for any offenses they may commit until the signing of a formal agreement between the United States and Nicaragua in December 1927. This degree provided all the official authority the Guardia needed. So against the will of the Nicaraguan people, this National Guard was created. This was against the will of the liberals and the whole, popular, vote. The population did not want a National Guard, but the white supremacists, rapists and murderous butchers and pimps of the U.S. government still, enacted this regard. It's an example of their arrogant white supremacist rapists and murderous butchers of the U.S. government. They're arrogant, mafia thugs and gangsters. So that was that. And then Sandino's motives for defying the United States were not due to anti-Americanism. Okay, Sandino, we talked about Sandino. It's important to understand this man. Okay, he is a man born of a woman who was an Indian and a man who was Hispanic, a Spanish speaking, person. We understand that Sandino, probably evoked a white supremacist rage among the rapists and murderous butchers of the U.S. government. They're rapist, angry, white, supremacist butchers, became very angry that Sandino and Indian could, promote, problems for the U.S. Army. They're rapists and murderous butchers of white supremacy. Always, point to the finger to people of color to, say that they are, subverting their, interest or subverting their imperialist interest. This was an imperial ambition by the United States. So we continued on, describe the, so we also saw that, Sandino was not, anti-imperialist, okay? He was against the change to a patrol fighting for the sovereignty of his country came gradually since the Americans helped keep the hated conservatives, or after 1928, the liberal traitor Moncada in power. Sandino had to fight the Americans. The experience of years of guerrilla conflict led him to believe that the greater problem was in American imperialism, and he was eagerly seized upon as a symbol of anti-imperialist cause throughout Latin America. Okay, he was an anti-imperialist. Sandino's motives, however, became much more from understanding the Nicaraguan situation than from any a priori commitment to an international anti-imperialist movement. So in summary, he was a logician. He was a smart man who understood American, rapists and murderous white supremacists, butchers, anti-Hispanic, rapists and murderous white supremacists, butchers of the U.S. Army and government in this vicious campaign in Nicaragua. He understood full well the U.S., design of this program to, enslave the Nicaraguan people. And it, bore fruit through their development of this, National Guard. So we went through all of the, the different things. There were multiple attacks by Sandino on the National Guard. You can read that for yourself. You can go through the book and read that. There were multiple attacks. It was a pretty bad thing for the United States. They were having trouble with Sandino. But that still doesn't mean that they don't respect the will of the people. That's the problem with the white supremacists in the United States. They're anti-democratic, they're fascist, they're white supremacists, and they're like mafia thugs. They're mafia thugs of white supremacy. And that's how they behaved in Nicaragua. They behaved like, butchers, murderous butchers and rapists and white supremacist thugs. So continuing on, we talked then about the Guardia agreements. After further discussions with the Nicaraguan government and minor changes in the wording of the treaty, the portions of the completed but as yet unsigned document were published in the leading conservative newspaper. The national and legal director of the Conservative Party quickly approved the proposed agreement, but General Chamorro and his supporters within the party did everything they could to prevent it ratification. This was the development of the National Guard. The State Department found the development of the National Guard, the treaty making, basically General Phelan prevented a draft of the treaty, which was a treaty regarding the National Guard, development of the National Guard, agreement for the establishment of the National Guard. So much dissent among the Nicaraguan people, including the conservatives and liberals within the government, for the creation of this organization. They thought it was going to, impinge on their democracy, was going to impinge upon their ability to go and, control their land with machine gun type white supremacists, rapists, and murderous butchers. They were going to, be subjected to white supremacists, murderous butchers, and rapists of the U.S. government. And that's what happened. That's how they used this organization to murder the Hispanic people of Nicaragua. It was an example of their, vicious campaign of terror against the Nicaraguan people. So continuing on, he talked about, so General Chamorro and his supporters within the party did everything they could do to prevent ratification by the Nicaraguan Senate. They tried to stop this National Guard creation. The objective of this effort was to prevent the guards replacing all local police forces. They wanted this National Guard to replace all the local police because, when you have a general administration centrally run under the white supremacists of the U.S. government, you have, a nasty campaign of rape and murder. And that's what it turned out to be. The white supremacists showed their real face in this, action in Nicaragua through the rape and murder by the white supremacists, rapists, and murderous butchers of the U.S. government. They showed their, angry, white supremacy in this, thing. So the objective of these efforts was to prevent the Guardians replacing all local police forces, thereby allowing conservative control police to influence the results of the 1928 elections. In order to muster support for their efforts, General Chamorro concentrated his criticism on the clause exempting American officers from the jurisdiction of Nicaraguan courts. So American officers who commit crimes in Nicaragua, they were exempted from any kind of court action. This is why the white supremacists, do these kinds of things. They create these kinds of laws in, the name of imperialism, in the name of their colonial, butcher state, their mafia thugs. And they, created this thing. So basically, American officers were exempt. And so that's why the whole thing was the white supremacists created this, action to prevent the Nicaraguan people from having sovereignty over their police and, not being able to prosecute Americans for rape and murder, right? I mean, the white supremacists are rapists. They're murderous butchers. They do this all over the place in South America and Central America and Latin America and all over the world. Their troops are notorious for being rapists and murderous butchers of the white, supremacist government of the United States. So, so basically that finished up that. And then we went over, and then towards the end of the chapter, we saw again, all right, so in outlying areas, the police also acted as judge and jury, combining police and judicial function. They also exercised control over the Jueces de Mesto, a rough equivalent of American justice of the peace, and over jueces assistants, the jefes de canton. Even Indian chiefs came under the guards' jurisdiction as they traditionally exercised certain police and judicial functions. Other police duties included control of all traffic in arms and explosives, the enforcement of sanitary regulations and suppression of contraband, and the control of all traffic of liquor and tobacco. These last functions in September 28 led the Guardias, replacing the Hacienda Treasury Department guards. These guards were described as, quote, very bad characters and as, quote, more of a menace to peaceful communities than the outlaws they were supposed to operate against, and their elimination evoked no recorded protest. So you can see the elimination of the guard wouldn't have been protested by the Nicaraguan people. Again, the U.S. government uses its own white supremacy to colonize lands, its own white supremacy rules, not worried about the democracy of the people, not worried about their feelings or popular ideas. They just want white supremacy. We want to be able to murder everyone, enslave everyone, and rape everyone. That's the U.S. government, the white supremacists, rapists, and murderous butchers of the U.S. government. So continuing on, we finished up. All right, so, we understood all sorts of problems with prostitution. We talked about prostitution again, the prostitution, of the U.S. government. The U.S. government creates the prostitutes in the third world. We reviewed their prostitution all over the world, in Vietnam, and, in Cambodia, in Laos. They create prostitutes all over the place in their colonial regimes. In Latin America, all over the place, prostitution is rampant under U.S. governed dictatorship. That's because the white supremacists are rapists and murderous white butchers of the U.S. government. They're white supremacists, murderous butchers. Okay, so finishing off, the United States, basically had three objectives. Okay, it failed. Okay, again, the United States failed in their objectives. You can see the objectives. The most pressing of these was establishing internal order by suppressing all uprisings directed against the government. So if the government had any uprisings, it was supposed to suppress them. From 1927 through 1932, this meant defeating Sandino. The final objective, and from the State Department's point of view, the dominant one, was to transform Nicaragua's armed forces into a non-political force dedicated to defending constitutional order and guaranteeing free elections. Didn't happen. It became a point of murdering the opposition, and political murder was what it was. That's because the white supremacists are rapists and murderous butchers who set up shop in foreign lands and murder the Hispanic people like rapists and murderous butchers. And then finally, we came to, the final objective, and the dominant one was to transform the Nicaragua into a non-political force. On these last two objectives, the American record was to fail far short. Again, American failure in Nicaragua, an American failure, white supremacist failure in Nicaragua, the rapists and colonial butchers, self-serving interests of their people and their, government and people and their army. They're rapists and murderous butchers. So finally, we're going to finish up with Chasing Sandino, the last chapter. The story of the military campaign conducted by the American Marines and the Nicaraguan Guardia Nacional against Augusto Cesar Sandino has been recounted in considerable detail several times. This chapter will not attempt to duplicate accounts already available, but will focus on the impact of the campaign on the development of the Guardia. Following the attack on Osatel, Sandino and his men were denounced as bandits by the Americans and the Diaz administration, and an effort was made to convince the public that they were mere thieves or wandering adventurers who would easily be eliminated. Other attempts sought to link Sandino with the communists or to dismiss him as a somewhat unbalanced fanatic. Simultaneously, the State Department officials were privately reassuring themselves that the Alcatel fiasco had finished Sandino, and he would return. We would not offer much further serious resistance. These attempts to dismiss Sandino as a bandit or a lunatic, and the wishful speculation that his movement would soon evaporate, proved grossly inaccurate. A strong Marine patrol sent into Nueva Segovia to crush Sandino did succeed in driving him out all of the towns he held, but was unable to force a decisive battle. In contrast to the opportunistic reports circulating around Washington, Major Oliver Floyd, the patrol's commander, reported that the population seemed generally friendly to Sandino. His men appeared determined to resist, and eliminating him would require a major campaign and many casualties. Under such circumstances, the Marines could not confine their duties to police and security measures, and the Guard's plans for slow expansion by a force of only a few hundred men no longer appeared feasible. Sandino, meanwhile, had regrouped his troops on an inaccessible mountain which he called El Chipote, and prepared to use guerrilla tactics to oppose the Marines and the Guard. He also had his men sign a lengthy document recognizing his leadership, denouncing the United States and the Diaz regime, and pledging themselves to fight to defend Nicaraguan sovereignty and dignity. After remaining relatively quiet throughout August 1927, Sandino resumed his attacks in September with an unsuccessful effort to overrun the combined Marine and Guardia garrison at Talpineca. Once again, the Guardia performed well in combat, despite their brief period of training. Sandino's continued activity produced consternation in Washington, where American policy in Nicaragua was already under strong attack. As early as July 27th, Secretary Kellogg had been complaining that we have been led to believe that armed opposition to the existing program will rapidly disappear and that we need to anticipate no serious complications on that score. As the situation developed, it seemed that this assumption might well prove false. The State Department urged immediate action to eliminate Sandino, but the Marines replied that operations during that rainy season due to end in November were very difficult, and any major effort would have to wait until the weather improved. The Marines did undertake a series of bombing raids against El Chipote, but the total effect of this effort seems scarcely to have been worth the cost of the bombs. Before the Marines and the Guardia could undertake a joint offensive against Sandino, it was necessary to establish principles that would govern relations between the two forces. On December 9, 1927, the Navy Department demanded that, except in emergency cases, the Guardia and the Marines 2nd Brigade, the unit stationed in Nicaragua, would function independently. Overall responsibility for coordinating their operations was given to the admiral commanding the Special Service Squadron. If combined operations were necessary, they would be directed by the further commander of the 2nd Brigade. These provisions further weakened the Nicaraguan government's theoretical control over the Guardia, since the Special Service Squadron's commander, whenever he felt an emergency existed, could take direct control of the Guardia operations without the necessity of even consulting the Nicaraguans. The long-delayed combined offensive finally began on December 19, 1927. Two columns with a total of 174 Marines and Guardia were involved, making this by far the largest force yet to be sent against Sandino. The guerrilla leader quickly ambushed both columns, slowing the offensive to a crawl. While El Chipote finally fell in January 26, 1928, Sandino had already evacuated his forces. In February, he began raiding coffee plantations around Matagalpa, acquiring funds and supplies in the process. He also ambushed a patrol of the newly arrived 11th Marine Regiment, which had been rushed into the area, killing 5 Marines and wounding 8. Sandino raised a force of several hundred men for this attack, including numerous local citizens who joined up for the ambush, then recruited to their civilian pursuit. Far from eliminating the guerrillas, the combat operations seemed to be gaining them increased popular support. Attempts to negotiate with Sandino proved as unsuccessful an effort to subdue him by force. A delegation from the Fellowship of Reconciliation failed in an effort to obtain a direct interview with the guerrilla leader, and the American civilian employee of the Marines who attempted to initiate private negotiations lost his life in the process. The Marine commander San Real del Norte, Lieutenant Wilbert Brown, also tried to initiate direct negotiations, but Sandino politely replied that he could not guarantee the officer's safety and in any case could think nothing Brown could say that would interest him. Brown next obtained permission to appoint Sandino's wife as telegraph operator in San Rafael, hoping to open up negotiations through her. He had her tell her husband that he had given her the job, give her some means of livelihood when she became a widow. Sandino replied with a final expression of appreciation and an expression of regret that he would be unable to do anything for the lieutenant's widow. A more official effort was to open negotiations made by the Special Service Squadron's commander, Admiral David Seller, who wrote Sandino on January 20, 1928 to try to persuade him to surrender. Sellers was only willing to discuss ways in which the rebel leader might come to accept the Stimson Agreement. But in his reply, Sandino demanded American withdrawal from Nicaragua, the removal of Diaz as president, and supervision of the 1928 elections by Latin American nations instead of by the United States. Since none of these points were deemed negotiable by the United States, efforts at finding a peaceful settlement collapsed against Sandino, requesting Latin America to be sovereign over, Nicaragua, not the United States, white supremacists, rapists, and murderous butchers. Frustrated by American inability to dispose Sandino, Secretary of State Kellogg sought the advice of Brigadier General Frank McCoy, the Army officer in charge of the American Electoral Commission in Nicaragua, in a letter that could be as easily have referred to Vietnam in the 1960s as it did to Nicaragua in the 1920s, Kellogg noted. There's a great deal of criticism in this country about the way in which these operations are being dragged out with the constant sacrifice of American lives and without any concrete results. So far as anybody here, we can see what is now taking place can and will go on indefinitely. People cannot understand why the job cannot be done, and frankly, I do not understand myself. There is an uneasy feeling that there may be something wrong with the plan of campaign or leadership. Inquiries at the Navy Department invariably elicit the response that the situation is entirely satisfactory. But neither the Congress nor the public can be expected to be satisfied with these general statements and criticism in the face of continuous losses and lack of any indication of definite conclusion of the operation is certain to become more and more insistent. General McCoy's reply did little to relieve Kellogg's anxiety, noting that he too was seriously concerned over the military situation. The general detailed what he felt were some of the problems plaguing the efforts to eliminate Sandino. Sandino's forces have the advantage of local language, thorough familiarity with the terrain, of the assistance, particularly as regards information of elements, some of which are in sympathy with Sandino, while others either consider or the continuance of his operations favorable to the immediate political purpose, or else do not dare to incur the hostility of the outlaws by giving information or assistance to our forces. Failure of the Nicaraguan government to pass to date legislation appropriate for the development of the electoral and Guardia programs have given encouragement to Sandino and his sympathizers and have prevented full potential use of the Guardia to take over responsibilities incident to the police functions so as to release the field operations the maximum marine strength. The pressures caused by the upcoming 1928 election supervision led to a general adoption of General McCoy's suggestion that the Guardia concentrate on police duties while the Marines pursued Sandino. The rest of 1928 was spent in continued scattered contact with Sandinistas, most of which involved ambushes of Marine patrols. From May 30th, 1928 till the end of the year, most Guardia were fully occupied with supervision of the campaign and election. During this period, Guardia patrols reported only 2 minor contacts with bandit forces and suffered no casualties. Following the 1928 elections, American military policy in Nicaragua underwent a significant change. The object now was to withdraw the Marines from combat, replacing them with Guardia units as rapidly as possible. The new Nicaraguan president, Liberal General Jose Moncada, also favored a change in tactics. He hoped to use the conflict with Sandino to develop a military force loyal to himself, something he could not do within the framework of the Guardia. This effort would run directly counter to United States policy, which aimed at making the National Guard Nicaragua's only armed force. On the day of Moncada's inauguration, a new order further advancing this policy went into effect, giving the Guardia alone the right to arrest civilians and stating that the Marines were to take an active combat role only when the Guardia proved unable to handle the situation. Moncada's solution for creating a force loyal to himself and waging a more efficient campaign against Sandino was to send into the field a force of voluntarios led by Nicaraguan officers, but operating in conjunction with Marine patrols. General Phelan and the 2nd Brigade commander strongly supported this proposal, but the American minister and General Beadle, the Guardia's commander, opposed it. Eventually, a compromise was arrived at. The Guardia gained control over voluntario funds and conducted a short training course for them, but once in the field, voluntarios operated independently. 2 columns of voluntarios, each containing about 90 men, operated in the field during 1929. The men were armed with Krag rifles, standard weapons of the Guardia, had khaki uniforms, and wore campaign hats, around which they placed their only identification, an 1.5-inch blue and white ribbon. Their most distinguishing characteristic was intense political partisanship. Not being members of the Guardia, they were freed from the nonpartisan requirements of the force, and most were intense supporters of General Moncada. The character of the officers was debatable at best. Commander of one of the columns was General Juan Escamilla, a Mexican who had fled the Nicaragua after participating in the De la Huerta revolt, and later served General Moncada in the 1926-7 Civil War. The commander of the Marine patrol that accompanied his force considered him an adventurer, and the State Department only openly expressed alarm at this appointment. Despite such unpromising material, hope persisted in some quarters that this force might solve the problem of combating Sandino. General Phelan, their chief virtue as a reputed ability to distinguish between guerrillas and peaceful civilians, solving the major problem of identifying the enemy. Once in the field, however, the volunteers proved of little worth. One column's major accomplishment was to violate the Honduran border, setting off an acrimonious international dispute. The other group, led by General Escamilla, did manage to kill one Sandinista, but spent most of its time terrorizing local inhabitants, creating a major refugee problem, causing many to join Sandino in order to survive. An official Marine report described the volunteers as poorly led, undisciplined, and more expensive than the Guardia, requiring constant supervision to prevent them from committing excesses against their political enemies. With the Marines no longer supporting the force and the State Department pressing for their elimination, the experiment came to an unlamented end in August 1921. When the disbanding of the entire force. The project for supplementing the Guardia with some type of national army modeled on traditional Nicaraguan military patterns, however, did not die with the volunteers. It was to be raised in varying forms again and again throughout the period of American intervention. Despite the voluntary fiasco, Sandino's fortunes seem to have reached a low point. Hoping for help from abroad, he had written in January to Mexican President Emilio Portes Gil, asking for permission to come to Mexico and confer with him. This request placed Portes Gil, who admired Sandino but did not want to jeopardize relations with the United States, in an awkward position. The Mexican president discussed this problem quite frankly with the American ambassador, Dwight Morrow. Ultimately agreed that in return for the United States raising no objection to the visit, Portes Gil would keep the guerrilla chieftain in Merida, Yucatan, and not allow him to set up base of operations with Mexico. Secretary of State Kellogg readily approved this arrangement, noting that he would prefer to have Sandino in Mexico under surveillance than in Costa Rica, Guatemala, or Honduras, where he might otherwise go. Because of various delays, Sandino did not arrive in Mexico until June 1929. Once there, he was, as promised, quickly sent to Merida, where, except for a brief visit with President Portes Gil in Mexico City, he was to remain for nearly 10 months. Sandino's absence did not end the fighting in Nicaragua, but it did reduce it considerably. To end even this activity, the new American minister, West Point graduate Matthew Hanna, proposed a program of road building in areas of guerrilla activity. This would not only provide easier access for counter-guerrilla forces, but would also provide employment for local residents in the hope of causing them to transfer their loyalties from Sandino to the government. In August 1929, an effort was made to put part of the program into action, but limited funds and Moncada's insistence on using it to employ personal favorites such as General Escamilla made it generally ineffective, and it was ended in September 1930. The Guardia, as well as the road building program, suffered from lack of funds in 1930. The onset of the Depression produced a crisis in Nicaraguan finances. Since the Guardia consumed a quarter of the government's income, President Moncada was determined to cut his expenses. The State Department opposed any cut in the Guardia's strength, but aware of the depth of the financial crisis, agreed to re-examine the possibility of supplementing it with auxiliary forces. One possibility favored by Minister Hanna was to reestablish municipal police under Guardia control, but paid by the towns in which they served throughout the nation. Hanna argued that this would not only cut Guardia expenses without reducing the force available for combat operations, but would also reduce the growing friction between the Guardia and the civil population arising from the exercise of police powers. The Marines favored an alternate plan which would supplement the Guardia with local citizens trained as an emergency auxiliary. Urban areas were encouraged to form local volunteer defense groups whose members, called cívicos, would be issued arms by the local Guardia commander whenever Sandinista activities in their area became threatening. In rural areas, companies and landowners were encouraged to hire watchmen who would be paid by them, but enlisted as cívicos to bring them under Guardia control. The Civico plan was eventually put into effect, providing a definite but limited aid to Guardia's budgetary and personal problems. They were, however, strictly a defensive organization and contribute little to any offensive attempts to eliminate Sandino's forces. President Moncada proposed a solution to both budgetary and military problems was a revival with as few modifications of his old voluntarius scheme, now called auxiliaries. Discussion concentrating the formation of such a force began in April 1930. Moncada's proposals were presented to the American by his Subsecretary of Foreign Affairs, General Anastasia Somoza. The Americans showed little enthusiasm for this approach, as Moncada temporarily dropped the idea. While Moncada and the Americans were debating ways of cutting Guardia expenses, Sandino was planning his return to Nicaragua. In April 1930, he slipped away from his Mexican host and made his way back to his native land. Conditions in Nicaragua had changed during this presence. The Marines had been pulled back to the larger towns except for their support. Active combat operations had been turned over to the Guardia. This reduced the forces for counterinsurgency campaigns, forcing the Guardia's Marines officers to seek other means of dealing with the guerrillas. Since much of the population in the thinly settled provinces of Jinotega and Nueva Segovia were, if not part-time guerrillas, at least sympathetic to Sandino, the Guardia commander at Azotal suggested a massive forced resettlement program for the area. After the population was removed, this proposal called for destruction of all buildings in the area and for treating as enemies any who remained. President Moncada approved this idea, but efforts to put it in practice were disastrous. Thousands of refugees poured into Matagalpa and Jinotega, where no preparation had been made for them. When word of this reached American minister, who had not been consulted, he immediately urged Moncada to end the program. Moncada promptly complied with this request. It was too late, however, to prevent the episode from hurting Guardia's image in the area and consequently increasing Sandino's local support just as the time he came to action. Sandino announced his return by gathering nearly 400 men near Jinotega and preparing it to attack that city. His plans were upset when the concentration was discovered and attacked by Marine aircraft. These attacks and a ground assault by the Jinotega garrison forced Sandino to abandon his plan and disperse his force. During this fiasco, his return encouraged men and from June 1930 until the end of American intervention in the National Guard would know few periods of rest or security. Twice during 1930, the Guardia attempted to crush Sandino's forces with major sweeping offensive. With both times, these efforts failed. While all available Guardia patrols tramped through the jungle searching for the guerrillas, bands of Sandinistas slipped through their flanks and raided other areas, virtually stripped of protection. A more effective means of controlling the guerrillas was adopted in the mountainous area around Jinotega. Here, the Guardia's Company M, commanded by Captain Louis B. Puller and Lieutenant William Lee, established a classic pattern of counterinsurgency patrol. And the basic plan of operation was simple. Garrisons were maintained in key towns while Puller and Lee, led by 30 Guardia enlisted men on highly mobile patrols against the reported Sandinista bands. Actually, Company M maintained 2 patrols, all of which remained in Jinotega while the others operated in the field. This assured that in the emergency, the garrison could always send out a fresh patrol. Though often in combat, Company M was never defeated and became in time a terror of the guerrilla bands throughout central Nicaragua. The key to its success was its mobility and freedom. Due to a lack of any defensive assignments to move any sector, Puller recruited local Indians for his command. Feeling that for confidence, loyalty, and combat ability, they had few equals. The Indians respected Puller in turn, and as his fame spread, they flocked into Jinotega, begging to join the Company M. Puller was not the only Marine who preferred recruiting Indians over any other citizens in Nicaragua. In camp or on garrison duty, Indians presented some problems, including a tendency to get drunk, but on patrol they would hike day after day under the most trying conditions and remain cheerful throughout, rarely complaining and often looking forward to a good fight. Company M's activities did not go unnoticed by Sandino. He placed the prize of 5,000 Cordobas on Puller's head, and his supporters circulated a host of atrocity stories concerning both Puller and his second-in-command, William Lee. No one ever collected the 5,000 Cordobas, but the atrocity stories have continued down to the present day. Unfortunately, the Guardia Company M was rather unique, and the situation in other areas remained critical. A plan was introduced to organize 8 similar units, distributing them throughout the most active combat areas, but the lack of funds kept this from ever being accomplished. The failure of the Guardia offensive in 1930, coupled with a guerrilla attack on the New Year's Eve, which killed 8 of the 10 Marines on a patrol repairing telephone lines, set the stage for a very active and perilous 1931. The death of the 8 Marines greatly increased pressures in the United States to withdraw Americans from combat in Nicaragua and made the State Department somewhat more receptive to President Moncada's continued pressure to create force auxiliaries. The Guardia's JEF director, General McDougall, Minister Hanna, and Secretary of State Stimson now agreed to allow the formation of a 500-man force of auxiliaries, provided that they were subject to an exclusive administration and control of the JEFI director of the National Guard. Moncada, who objected to tight Guardia controls, now proposed reducing the force to 125 men and appointing 2 Nicaraguans to field grade ranks to serve as advisors with the auxiliaries. Both Hanna and McDougall rejected these proposals, fearing that the Nicaraguan advisors would introduce complications, misunderstandings, and possibly divided control. This dispute lasted several months. During this period, the Guardia's position became even more vulnerable when Secretary of State Simpson announced that 1,000 of the 1,500 Marines in Nicaragua would be withdrawn during 1931, and the remainder, except for those serving directly with the Guardia, would be confined to an instructional battalion in Managua and a single aviation squadron. The Nicaraguan government did agree to furnish funds to expand the Guardia by an additional 500 men who were to be used exclusively in combat areas. But before this buildup could take place, Sandino struck again. In April 1931, the guerrillas launched a series of major attacks against Nicaragua's isolated east coast. With the support of local deputy in the Nicaraguan Congress, Adolfo Cockburn, several Sandinista columnists managed to penetrate deep into the area before being detected. One force commanded by Pedro Blanda seized the headquarters of the American-owned Bragman's Bluff Lumber Company, massacring the American and British employees and sacking the company town. A Guardia patrol that arrived later was ambushed and driven back to Puerto Cabezas. Meanwhile, another guerrilla column briefly seized the northernmost settlement on Nicaragua's east coast, Cabo Gracias a Dios, and panic began to spread among Americans in Puerto Cabezas. At this point, the American charge in Managua, William Bullock, asked the Navy to dispatch a special service squadron cruiser to Puerto Cabezas. This action received considerable criticism, as both the squadron's commander and the Guardia's Jeff director questioned Bullock's right to make such a request, and Secretary of State Simpson complained that the action was taken without consulting either himself or the Secretary of the Navy. A cruiser was dispatched and a force landed, but Secretary Simpson made it clear that in the future he would approve such landings only when it absolutely needed to save the lives of American and foreign people, excluding property. The entire situation angered the Secretary and led him to question the National Guard's organization and leadership. On April 15th, he telegraphed the American minister in Managua a report that 4 separate bandit columns were moving on the East Coast, and added that such developments without earlier warning would seem to indicate a serious lack in the leaders of the Guardia. Stimson's comments touched upon the continuing failure to develop an effective and reliable intelligence system. This was due in part to the support Sandino enjoyed from the inhabitants of the areas in which he operated. This not only denied information to the Guardia, it also provided Sandino with an extremely effective intelligence service of his own. Keeping him well informed of the Guardia movements, Captain Puller was once informed that before he could hope to catch Sandino, he would have to eliminate all the spies in Jinotega, a task which, unless one were willing to shoot or otherwise remove the majority of the population, was probably impossible. Guardia forces from either other East Coast points were rushed to Puerto Cabezas to prevent that port from being overrun. For a while, the situation was critical, but after a sharp exchange in which the guerrilla chief Blandon was killed, the Sandinistas withdrew from the area. At the same time, additional naval vessels were dispatched to Cabo Gracias a Dios and Bluefields. The guerrillas, however, withdrawing, and the vessels soon returned to Panama. Severe as was the damage done on these raids, it pales into insignificance beside the catastrophe with a much more powerful force inflicted on Managua. On March 31st, 1931, the city was devastated by an earthquake and subsequent fire. The Guardia compound at the Campo del Morte, including the new military academy, was destroyed. 2 Guardia and national officers were killed and 3 others injured when the National Penitentiary also collapsed. Immediately following the quake, the Guardia was called upon to provide emergency medical aid, ensure food distribution, and fight the fires that raged throughout the city. The last week proved doubly difficult as the city's water supply had been destroyed in the quake. In desperation, the Marines and Guardia used dynamite to try to halt the flames, giving rise to later rumors that they had deliberately destroyed much of the city. Even with their efforts, some fires burned for days, but most of the destruction was confined to the downtown area. The Guardia was also assigned the task of burying the dead, preventing looting, and reestablishing communications between Managua and the outside world. For their efforts, 16 Guardia officers received presidential gold medals of merit from the Nicaraguan government. In this case, at least, the Guardia and its American officers contributed to the saving rather than taking of lives in Nicaragua. Taking advantage of the confusion following this disaster, the guerrillas moved their attacks inland. They suffered a major loss in May when one of their most able generals, Miguel Angel Ortez, was killed, but they gained a measure of revenge for this the following month when General Padron Altermano ambushed another Guardia patrol, killing both American officers and 1 Nicaraguan enlisted man. The officers were largely responsible for their own defeat. They had stopped inside a small house to eat without taking the elementary precaution of first posting a guard outside. This allowed Pedron to position his men before opening fire, making his victory almost inevitable. The conflict between the Guardia and Sandino continued to escalate into the summer. Action reached a peak in July when the Guardia reported 14 contacts with the guerrillas and lost 2 killed and 14 wounded. By fall, fighting was again spreading into new, hitherto peaceful areas. An especially threatening development occurred in November 1931 when 2 guerrilla columns under General Juan Pablo Umanzar and General Gregorio Calandras invaded the thickly settled department of Leon. They occupied the sugar production center of Chitagalpa, throwing the department into panic. This forced the State Department to take 2 unpleasant steps, giving consent to Makata's long-deferred plan to organize a force of auxiliaries and again sending Marines outside of Managua, this time as guards on trains between the capital of Corinto. These actions freed enough Guardia to drive the rebels back into the hills following several sharp engagements. The new auxiliaries worked out surprisingly well. Initially, 300 were raised, and the men being paid $12 a month, plus uniforms and 20 cents a day food allowance. Placed under Guardia regulations and command, they were used to supplement combat patrols as conditions seemed to warrant. The program was continued through 1932, during which 250 additional auxiliaries were recruited. Anxious to speed their own withdrawal, the Americans now dropped their opposition to this force. Indeed, less than a month before the final withdrawal, the last American, Jeff Director, specifically requested permission from the President Moncada to recruit an additional 100 auxiliaries. The fighting in 1931 had clearly demonstrated that the Guardia, even with the Marine support, was hard-pressed to contain, let alone destroy Sandino's forces. In November, the American charge, William Bullock, glimly noted, "The bandit situation is grave or graver than at any time since I have been in Nicaragua." Nevertheless, 1932 opened on a quiet note, with the Guardia reporting only 5 light contacts and no casualties during January. During February, however, there were 15 clashes with 4 guardsmen killed and 8 others, including 1 Civica, wounded. The pace continued for much of the rest of the year, with 104 contacts between Guardia and guerrilla forces reported from April through September. Throughout the fighting, fairly accurate reports were kept of Marine and Guardia casualties, but since the guerrillas usually carried off their dead and wounded, estimates of the losses were often unreliable. During the years of fighting with Sandino, 122 combined Marine and Guardia combat deaths were reported. The Guardia alone reported 1,115 guerrillas killed in the same period, but this total is undoubtedly exaggerated. An example of the problem involved in reporting Sandinista casualties occurred on March 1932 when 2 Guardia patrols mistakenly fired upon each other. One patrol soon realized this error and broke off the contact, but the other reported this conflict as a clash with 200 bandits and claimed to have killed at least 2 of them. In reality, this force they had engaged consisted of 27 Guardia, and it had suffered no losses. The Nicaraguan presidential election overshadowed the fight with Sandino during the fall of 1932. The victorious candidate was Liberal Juan Batista Sacasa, the former vice president. His victory raised hopes that following American withdrawal, Sandino would reach terms with the man he had formerly fought for. The election did not influence the conflict for the rest of 1932. However, his 27 contacts, costing the Guardia 300 killed and 6 wounded, were reported during November and December. The most spectacular engagements occurred less than a week before the Marines departed. One of the last official acts, President Moncada planned to dedicate a new section of the National Railway. Sandino, who hated Moncada, hoped to use the occasion to strike a final blow at his former commander, but the Guardia heard of his plan to send Captain Puller, 7 lieutenants, and 60 pack men to thwart him. They surprised 250 men under General Umanzar, who were busily engaged looting the railroad companies. In the ensuing battle, the guerrillas were badly beaten, even being forced to leave their dead behind. 30 guerrillas were lost in this engagement against the Guardia, casualties of only 3 killed and 3 wounded. The new line was peaceably inaugurated 2 days later. In more than 5 years of warfare, the Guardia and the Marines failed to eliminate Sandino, leaving him as a great threat in January 1933, as he had been in any previous point in his career. On the other hand, the guerrillas, except for occasionally daring forays, had been largely confined to isolated, thinly populated sections of Nicaragua, and had never taken a major city. The campaign was frustrating one for the Guardia, but at the end of 1933, they showed no signs of being ready to abandon the fight. How this struggle would progress without American officers and American air support remained to be seen. So that's it. That's the chapter, Chasing Sandino. So you can see the U.S. government, the white supremacists, rapists, and murderous butchers, chasing Sandino over and over again. We talked about, the Guardia, the Sandino continued activity, produced consternation in Washington, where American policy in Nicaragua was already under strong attack. Everybody hated American policy. The white supremacists, rapists, and murderous butchers of the U.S. Army. It's, public, it's Congress, it's president. All of them, were criticized immensely for their policy towards Sandino and Nicaragua. As early as July 27th, Secretary Kellogg had been complaining that we have been led to believe that the armed opposition to the existing program would rapidly disappear and that we need to anticipate no serious complications on that score. Okay, as the situation developed, it seemed that this assumption might well prove false. The State Department urged immediate action to eliminate Sandino, but the Marines replied that it was too wet in the rainy season. They undertook bombing raids. Again, the U.S. government bombing the cities in Nicaragua. Rapists and murderous butchers. Who are you to bomb Hispanic lands? You rapist white supremacist, murderous butcher. So continuing on, frustrated. So again, American inability was to dispose Sandino. They were unable to dispose Sandino. Multiple attempts to try to persuade him to surrender, to get him to withdraw. So Sandino was pretty simple. He demanded American withdrawal from Nicaragua, the removal of Diaz, the conservative, pro-American president, and supervision of the 1928 elections by Latin American nations instead of by the United States. Obviously, a smart Hispanic man. For the first time, he stated to the United States, the rapist white supremacists and murderers, butchers of the U.S. government, they need to get out of politics in Latin America because they are thugs. They created a mafia state of vicious gangsters in Latin America. They need to stay in United States. That is their domain. That is the only place they should be allowed to be. This colonialism is an embarrassment to world politics. It's an embarrassment to the white supremacists, murderers, rapists, and butchers of the U.S. government. So continuing on, so again, the U.S. government, can't, work with, other countries. They can't work with, Latin American countries. They don't belong there. They need to get out. That's what Sandino said. That's what everyone said. All of their statements was, get out of Latin America, you rapist and murderous butcher. So continuing on, they were trying to figure out how to get rid of, get rid of Sandino. So they did this population removal, the same thing they do everywhere, create millions of refugees of Nicaraguans. Again, the standard thing, the standard approach, the U.S. just, pacifying the citizens, murdering the citizens, raping the citizens. That is the white supremacists of the U.S. government. That is what they do over and over again, like vicious mafia thugs. They're white supremacists, mafia people of the U.S. government. So thousands of refugees poured into Matagalpa and Jinotega, where no preparation had been made for them. The massive forced resettlement program for the area of Nueva Segovia and Jinotega, where the guerrillas were, was a forced evacuation program by Guardia Commander Ocotal. So again, the wrong approach to fixing problems is resettle the population so that you can slaughter a few rebel guerrillas. That's the approach, make refugees for the sake of 15 guerrillas. You dry up the ocean for the sake of the few fish in there. The rapist white supremacists and murderers of the U.S. government. Okay, so then the raids of the Sandino were discussed. Rushed to Port Cabezas. There was a huge attack by Sandino on Port Cabezas. Basically service was as the severe damage was done in the raids. Then there was an earthquake in Managua and subsequent fire. We talked about Stimson. So Secretary of State Simpson was, basically responsible. It was Roosevelt's administration was the responsible for this refugee creation and this murder campaign. Again, the rapist white supremacists, and murderous butchers of the U.S. government. And then following the quake, the Guardia was called upon to halt. Taking advantage of the confusion of the disaster, the guerrillas now moved their attacks inland. Basically Miguel Angel Ortez was killed, but gained revenge the following month. General Pedro Almirano ambushed a guard patrol, killing both American officers and one Nicaraguan enlisted man. Officers were largely responsible for their own defeat. They stopped to have lunch. So the officers stopped to have lunch and they were murdered. So that's basically an excellent book. Guardians of the Dynasty. It's a history of, Guardians of the Dynasty. This is the real title. The title in the book that I have is, shortened, and it is a novel. They have created a novel because the white subverters of democracy failed to accept democracy. Guardians of the Dynasty, a history of the U.S. created. Guardia Nacional de Nicaragua and the Somoza family. Excellent book we've started to discuss. So we're going to make some comments and finish up. So please download the Google Drive link. It's in the discussion section. We continue with Guardians of the Dynasty, the first chapter written by Miguel Descoto, a major figure from Nicaraguan foreign minister. Miguel Descoto's review of the racist U.S. Army, Congress, and public rapists and murderous bitchers in Nicaragua is discussed. Nicaragua was a huge geographic interest as the Spanish were planning to construct a canal through the country. The United States, Britain, and France sought to prevent Spanish construction of this canal, and the U.S. became interested in stopping Spain from a canal and held on to the territory. He described the history of Somoza, Descoto. He made clear that Somoza is a psychopath who transforms evil acts, unquestionably evil, and form and uniformly condemned, into good acts and acts accordingly. It is as if he is detached from reality and becomes good with each murder, torture, and rape. This is similar to the U.S. Congress, President, and the Army, who are violent white murderers who transform the uniformly condemned acts of evil to a good result, as well as we have discussed throughout the Third World. The U.S. government in Nicaragua colony in 1912, and all important political decisions were made in the American legation at Managua or in the State Department in Washington. The racist white thugs of Washington made Somoza into a legacy of despotism, murder, torture, and rape of the Nicaraguan people, despite outcries from Latin America, including political leaders and major press outlets. The murderous white butchers of Washington failed to see the words of Somoza's close friend and relative by marriage, who states, among other symptoms, Somoza suffers from a persecution complex. He feels he is being persecuted and at times the urge to persecute. He also has a deformed conscience. No cries of desperation were heard by the U.S. White Army rapists, pimps, and murderous white butchers in their vicious campaign against the people of Nicaragua. Miguel states that if the United States does not stop support to the oppressive Somoza dynasty, then one will have to agree that those who say that it is far from having been mistaken, the United States Nicaraguan policy has been intentionally criminal. We then discuss the history of Nicaragua, including the first conquest in 1523, when the Spanish Gil Gonzalez fought the Indian army led by Diriangen. Spain conquered the colonized territory, who now bears the name of the Indian chief. The Indians could never be forced to accept servitude and exploitation. They were incorporated into the Spanish army conquest of Peru and Ecuador. The colonial period never really ended for Nicaragua. It is the oppressive, racist, rapist, and violent white murderers of the U.S. government, as well as the British government, who by virtue of their machine gun affinities, forced the exploitation of the Nicaraguan people. The British and their murderous hands had their murderous hands in first. In 1845, they took the East Coast. Then in February 1948, they clashed with Nicaraguan forces and defeated them and killed several of them. The United States then extended its capital, exploitative, and murderous interest through Cornelius Vanderbilt, who developed the Accessory Transit Company, a combined stagecoach and lake and riverboat transport system across the country. Vanderbilt's efforts conflicted with the British control, and Clayton-Bulwer Treaty in 1850 provided any future canal and railway access would be under joint American-British control, toll equal to both nations. Nicaragua was not even acknowledged by the white murderers, violent butchers, and rapists of the United States and Great Britain. Typical colonial mafia gangsters. The U.S. and Britain spread political conflict and carnage throughout Nicaragua following this treaty. Then William Walker, the American journalist, we discussed him. We're going to skip him. We then next important is General Jose Santos Zelaya, who led the revolt and captured Nicaragua in 1893. He ruled for 16 years. The British withdrew with the U.S. intervention off the Mosquito Coast. Zelaya brought a radical change and modernized Nicaragua more than any other president. He was not able to continue because of the murderous colonial mafia regime of the United States. Butcher's intervention in the last days of Zelaya. The United States could no longer tolerate Zelaya because of his reform and nationalism, typical of the American army, rapists, and murderous white butchers. Then there was Estrada. We talked about Estrada and Moffett. We continued with Secretary of State Knox, who admonished the gesture of Nicaraguan tariffs that were proposed by Moffett, who was the American minister to the Bluefields. Zelaya had executed 2 Americans who set mines to blow up the government ships, but the United States government, rapists and murderous butchers, gave the excuse to break relations with Zelaya. He resigned as a result of the white mafia politicians, American dictums, and Madrid took power, and he was not suitable because he was Zelaya's vice president. They required a total new administration that continued the fight, and then, Estrada was brought, so then we continued. Diaz was then put in power. Diaz was put in power by the United States, a puppet. His regime faltered, and then, there was an uprising against his regime, and then General Zelaya, while the U.S. sent its interventions to protect the faltering regime. So basically, it was an occupation of Nicaragua by the United States Army and Marines. It's under the colonel Joseph Pendleton, and the rapists and racist murderous butchers of the United States conducted a vicious campaign against Zelaya and Mena to surrender. Diaz, put in power, was eventually succeeded to Solorzano Sacasa. And we know, basically, in summary, the mafia, American government, murders, white butchers campaign against Nicaragua was a devastating reality of 150 years of colonization. So again, I'll be back tomorrow. Please, read the book, download the book. It's great to, see everyone. Have a great day. Krishna, the Iyer Think Tank in Delray Beach.